Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Planning Commission hearing for October 25th. If you'll join me for the flag salute.
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good morning, and David, if you will please do the TV announcement and roll call.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the Commission. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County and Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, and Santa Maria and Orchid areas. Rebroadcasts of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. Today's hearing will also be streamed live on CSB TV's website and will be available for download in a day or two. Now for the roll call, Commissioner Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Ferrini.
Here.
Commissioner St. John.
Here.
And Chair Blau.
Here.
And for the record, Commissioner Cooney is absent today.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Wilson, are you going to give us the status report and the projection report?
Good morning, Chair. I can provide the agenda status report and I'll move into the projection report afterwards. As far as agenda today, we have one item on the agenda under the standard agenda, which is the presentation on the Cannabis Land Use Ordinance Amendments and Licensing Program, and staff is here to present that information today. On the projection report, looking forward on next week, November 1st, there are 3 items on that. SoCal Gas is going to come back, as was continued from a previous meeting. It'll be modified from what you heard before. There's a lot line adjustment, and then there's an appeal on the November 1st. And then November 8th, we had mentioned at the last hearing about the joint meeting with the Ag Advisory Committee. We went over some of the topics. Unless you have other topics, we'll proceed with the topics that we discussed and provided some priority on those topics as we mentioned at the last hearing.
Mr. Brown.
I just have a question about that meeting. I was speaking to my representative on the AAC, and he was making an inquiry about the 2-hour issue. I didn't know whether or not there was if the AAC had expected longer than just 2 hours. This is an open-ended meeting. This is as long as it takes meeting.
So the 2 hours that are shown on the projection report, I think, are the estimated time with the number of topics that we had been given by the AAC.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's up to the Planning Commission how long they want to discuss those topics. There is one other item, or there's 2 other items on that day. The Old Town parking lot and then the Bell Street ordinance.
I'm wondering, is this a time certain? Could we do one like at the end of the agenda so that if it goes over, we don't have other people waiting? Is that rather than at the beginning? I don't know how you're going to, what order you're going to do this in.
So we could
put it at the end.
Yeah, we could put the agenda where the regular items are first on the agenda and then close with the Ag Advisory Joint Workshop.
Yeah, then that would allow extra time if need be.
Yeah, and I'll just point out that the Old Town parking lot, my best guess is it's a 15-minute decision-making process, not an hour and a half. So I would agree that we should probably put both those items up first, put the AC meeting second, because I think we'll end up with both of the first 2 issues done in the first hour. So we'll have a good 3-hour block to go with them, and we can go after lunch if we need to. That's Michael's call, by the way, but we can certainly suggest that to him, and I think if the rest of you agree we'll do it that way, then he'll agree to it.
Good, thank you.
Okay?
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
Wait, he's not done.
You have more?
No,
Okay.
I'm doing it.
This is the time when we invite anyone to...
He's got more. He's not done.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, yeah, Chair Blau and Chair Blau, I have a couple more hearings if you want me to continue with the... So so December 6th, there are a number of items on that day. The agenda is pretty full. There's a couple items on there that I think that might go relatively fast, so that it might not take as long as it's being estimated at the 7 hours. However, we'll have to play that one by ear as we get closer to that December 6th hearing date. And then December 13th, there's 2 items on that. They're both subdivisions, one in Orchid and the other one outside of Lompoc. And then also on December 13th, we have that guidelines for determining significance for the cultural resources that Director Russell had placed on the agenda. to bring before the Planning Commission.
And you, excuse me.
Go ahead.
And you expect that that will take 2 hearings to address that?
Chair Blau and Commissioner Brown, I think that was placed on the agenda for 2 hearings in case there was further questions.
Oh, okay.
So if it was accomplished in 1 hearing, I think that would be fine.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So on December, one thing we'd like to, as a housekeeping item, on December 20th, we had talked about this at prior hearings, is that joint workshop on December 20th with the Montecito Planning Commission. In addition, we're requesting to also place the accessory dwelling unit ordinance amendments as part of that joint hearing on December 20th. So today, we'd like to ask, when I finish the projection report, if you would like to set up a special hearing for December 20th for that joint meeting date.
I will probably be absent that day, but that wouldn't stop you.
And then on January 20th or January 10th, there's 2 items on that, and then January 17th, there's 1 item so far. I think that's as far as we want to go today as far as the projection report.
Great. Any further questions?
I do, and I thought that we were going to add a second cannabis hearing for the South Coast at a subsequent meeting in January. We talked about that.
Yeah,
We talked about that at one
January
meeting.
10th, January 10th.
Well, that's one, but we're not
Oh, it's in
having,
Santa Maria.
right. We had talked about that at our last hearing, and Diane acknowledged, yes, we could do it on the 24th. I said, I'm not here, and I believe that she said the 31st. So I see Mr. Kleeman shaking his head, but it was my understanding that we were going to have another one for the South Coast.
Yeah, that'd be news, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, that'd be news to me. The last presentation on cannabis to your commission was scheduled for early January, as I'll discuss later on today.
I understand, but those are the ordinance amendments, right? And that's the first, last, and only time we hear them, right?
Yeah, the goal is to get these ordinance amendments to the board by February 6th, so if you're considering them on January 24th, that might be too late.
Then perhaps we could think about a special hearing at some point, earlier, maybe, that week, or maybe staff could consider that when we come back. Because I think that it's going to take us more than 3.5 hours myself. So I would just urge you to look at that, and then we've got time to do schedule a special hearing, but if you would, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Kleeman, look at that then. Thank you.
Chair Bell, Commissioner Brown, just for clarification, you're looking at requesting, if it's possible, to have a special hearing during what time period in December for the cannabis?
January.
In January?
In January. At our last hearing, we talked about the fact that this is a Santa Maria meeting, and this is reviewing the ordinance amendments. And I said, because there is significant interest from South Coast folks, that it'd be nice to have one down here as well. And Ms. Black said, January 24th, I'm not here because that's a day off. I mean, that's a Montecito meeting traditionally, but perhaps we could set a special hearing if the 31st is not acceptable to staff. We could just look at something earlier.
Just a thought, you only have one item on January 17th. I'm guessing that's probably Montecito. This is probably an error on here, printing this, but I don't know.
That's a second district item, January 17th.
Oh, 17th, but it looks like we could do it
the 17th.
Could do the 17th.
Right.
Yeah, so Chair Blau, Commissioner Brown, the Montecito Planning Commission, they set a hearing for January 3rd. Normally, it would have been on that 17th, but they switched it so that they would be hearing the cannabis on January 3rd.
Okay, so we could do that second cannabis meeting that day.
So we'll go back, Chair Blau and Commissioner Brown, we'll go back and discuss what we can do in January for hearing dates.
All right, thank you, I appreciate you looking at that.
Well, and just as a point of order here, I think at the January 10th meeting, we could continue, we could decide then to continue that meeting to January 17th as well. So I think we'll make the decision on the 10th and holding the 17th open as a possibility.
Yeah, but I think staff should just be aware that that might be our intention.
Right. Okay, are we done?
Chair Blau, we are done, thank you.
Okay, good. Now I'll come back. This is the time when we allow public comment for any item not on today's agenda. And I know we have people in Santa Maria, so I'll ask if there's anybody there. I'll ask Commissioner Brown if we have anybody here. Okay. Not seeing anybody rise, although I can't see Santa Maria right now. Okay, I'm going to make the assumption that there's not anybody there. Oh, yes, go ahead. Can you hear us? We can't hear you yet, so we're going to take a second or two here and see if our technician can solve that problem.
Okay.
Now, we've solved the problem.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Okay. In response to your question about whether there was anyone planning to speak for that open public comment, no, from Santa Maria. Those of us are here to speak on the first agenda item. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now we have the minutes of October 11th that we need to approve. And I do have, before you make a motion, I do have one correction. If you look on, it's called as page 4, item condition 5. Applicant doesn't record codes, covenants, and restrictions. It's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, not codes.
In addition, on page 3, under revisions to conditions of approval, the grading and drainage one, this was the individual lots versus the centralized. Could we rewrite it to say in the final full sentence where it says drainage from the 5 proposed lots shall instead of will be managed instead of accommodated by either individual retention basins on each, and then keep going, proposed parcel, or by a centralized retention basin? Just so it's clear. That word accommodated didn't work well for us in Golden Inn. I just want to avoid it. And also under commissioners absent, it did note that Commissioner Brown was absent, but it also said none.
Yeah, no, he's got that.
He got that, okay. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Freedy, you were going to make a motion to approve?
Yes.
Second?
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And I'll abstain.
Okay. All right, moving on to director's report. Do we have a director's report this morning?
Yes, good morning, Commissioner Chair, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Dan Clement. I'm the Deputy Director for Long Range Planning, filling in for Dr. Russell, who is out this week. So since your last Planning Commission hearing, there's been one board hearing that was held on October 17th, and there were a handful of planning-related items, some of which occurred on the consent agenda, others were on the departmental agenda. So taking the consent agenda items first, there was an approval of a new ag preserve contract and one replacement contract, as well as 2 set hearings. The first is a set hearing for the board's consideration of the Coastal Commission's modifications to the Eastern Gleeta Valley Community Plan. The Coastal Commission approved the Eastern Gleeta Valley Community Plan LCP amendment subject to 13 modifications. So what the board will be considering is whether or not to adopt the LCP amendments with those modifications. So that's an important hearing for a project that's been long in the works. So.
And they're likely to be controversial before the board?
Commissioner Blau, Commissioner Brown, I'd say the only remaining controversial issue has to do with prohibition on private staircases for access to the beach. Basically, the Coastal Commission adopted a modification to the plan which would only allow staircases if they are for public access to the beach, and there'd be a prohibition once again on staircases to the beach for private access. So that is one that was controversial when the board considered the consolidation of the coastal and inland zoning regulations years ago, and that one's come back up again. So, and the other set hearing was for the revised Tahiguas Resource Recovery Project and a comprehensive plan amendment that will be considered by the board on November 7th as well. For the departmental agenda items, there was an item that was continued until December 5th, and it involved an appeal of the Montecito Planning Commission's approval of a project. And then also at that hearing, the board considered the Article 10 amendments. That is the amendments to the existing regulations that pertain to non-conforming medicinal cannabis cultivators. And I'll go into more detail about that when we get to the first item on your regular agenda. So, but if you have any questions about that, I'd be more than happy to answer those right now.
Commissioner Brown.
Well, the detail I'm interested in is the detail of the process, how it's going to work. Of course, we don't know how it's going to work exactly. You're taking back the amortization piece, but it's the other piece that's sort of in flux.
Yes, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown. When we made the presentation on your recommended amendments to Article 10, there seemed to be support for the amortization period. However, there did not seem to be an equal amount of support for the legal nonconforming determination process. So what the board directed us to do was return on November 14th with an alternative set of ordinance amendments for consideration, which only have the amortization piece of the Article 10 amendments, which we were initially recommending to them.
And what does that mean to applicants what does that mean, since I understand that the state is starting to accept applications for licenses in December? What does that mean?
They're going to start, the state is going to start accepting applications in December. Their goal is to start issuing temporary licenses come the 1st of January next year.
Right.
And then following that, they will eventually get to issuing annual licenses. So there's going to be this period, particularly for those who are operating in the coastal zone, where there will be adopted regulations possibly that have not been certified by the Coastal Commission. So the question is, what are we going to allow with regard to their operations during that interim period until the Coastal Commission considers adoption of those regulations? So the amortization period, effectively, it would be a period in which those who are currently operating could either scale down their operations and ultimately cease operating, or alternatively, if they can operate under the new regulations that are adopted, they could, that'd be a time during which they would apply and prepare to get the entitlements and the licenses to operate under the new regime.
But if you're talking about the ordinances won't be adopted until 2018. So for these guys who come up, they apply. Can you just give me the process so I can understand what is going to occur in terms of sort of the rules that you follow for, or the procedures that are going to be in place for people applying for these temporary licenses in terms of county regulations or lack of regulation, or whatever piece, however you're going to look at that in terms of what they have to do? Do you have to provide something to them in order for them to apply to the state?
Yeah, we're kind of jumping the gun here because I was going to go into this on the first item. I could go over right now, or if you want to withhold it, because we're getting more into the details of
Why don't you go ahead and wait?
Okay.
But I listened to the whole hearing.
Well, I did too, but I just,
Yeah, okay.
it's important to get some clarity, I think, and certainty.
Absolutely.
Okay. we'll
Just
wait then.
if I don't cover this in my presentation, by all means, just remind me and I'll cover it.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions? Or do you have more?
Just really quick, just heads up on things that are coming up at the board. So on November 14th, there's going to be a very important item regarding cannabis. Once again, the board's going to consider those changes to Article 10, and then there's also going to be a presentation on possible staffing implications for enforcement given the new activities that will occur with the cannabis industry. And then there will also be a discussion about the economic implications of the cannabis ordinance and possible taxation issues. And then there will be a summary of the licenses and activities that the board considered with regard to cannabis on September 19th. And once again, I'll get into more detail about that in the presentation. There will also be a set hearing on November 7th for a December 5th hearing regarding the Koch appeal of the Planning Commission's denial of a land use permit. And then we're going to be making a presentation on December 5th to the board regarding enforcement options, that is staffing enforcement options for short-term rentals. We're anticipating that the board will be requesting us to change our enforcement approach with regard to short-term rentals. So, and we would have to build that into our work program and budget for the next fiscal year. So we're going to the board in December just to get a read on what they expect with regard to staffing and how we approach enforcement. So.
And that includes homestays as well?
Correct. And then finally, on December 5th, there will be the annual report on the CREF funds. And that is basically it for the rest of the calendar year.
Any further questions? Not seeing any. Mr. Villalobos, if you'll read our first item into the record.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Planning Commission received an update on the Cannabis Land Use Ordinance Amendments and Licensing Program.
All right, once again, good morning, Commissioner Chair, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Dan Clement, once again, for the Long Range Planning Division. And I'm going to be providing you with just sort of a high-level update on where we are with regard to the Cannabis Land Use Ordinance and Licensing Program. So, just a little bit of a recap why we're here and why we're even talking about cannabis right now. And cannabis regulations really started in earnest in 1996 with the adoption of regulations to allow a medicinal cannabis industry, and that was with the Compassionate Care Act, which was further refined in 2015. What the state found was that there were some gaps in the 1996 law. There were some problems developing. So what the state wanted to do was get more control over the medicinal cannabis industry. And if you read the Medicinal Cannabis and Regulation Safety Act that was adopted in 2015, there's actually a licensing program that was supposed to be implemented similar to what is currently under consideration. But the state never got to the point where they were implementing that licensing program, because what they also saw was that there was the ballot initiative, Proposition 64, that was being proposed in November 2016. So the state decided to hold off on refining the regulations pending the outcome of whether or not recreational cannabis use would be allowed. So lo and behold, Proposition 64 was passed. So the real effort over the last calendar year has been trying to consolidate the medicinal regulations, the new recreational regulations, into one comprehensive regulatory regime. And I should state that these are all the statutes, and what is also passed and accompanies the statutes are implementing regulations that the individual agencies that are responsible for enforcing these laws develop to further refine or create procedures for how they're going to implement the requirements of these laws. And those are still under development. There was a number of those regulations that were published in draft form earlier this year, but with the changes in the law, they rescinded those regulations, and now they're working on new regulations, which we anticipate to be published at the end of November. And this is all gearing up for the state to begin issuing licenses once again January 1st of next year. And as I mentioned during the director's report, initially what the state intends to do is issue temporary licenses, and these would be 4 months in duration. And then ultimately, once they get all of their regulations and procedures in effect, then they're ultimately going to get to a point where they're going to issue annual licenses. So, with regard to local cannabis laws, currently, as you're well aware from the hearing last month, the county currently only allows 2 types of cannabis activities, and those are embedded in Article 10 of the county code. And basically what it says is that there are 2 exceptions to the prohibition on cannabis activities. The first is cultivation for personal use, and second is with regard to those cultivators who are in operation as of January 19th, 2016, they may continue to operate under a legal non-conforming status for the purpose of, once again, cultivating medicinal cannabis. But none of the recreational activities are currently allowed, with the one exception. Local jurisdictions can regulate all aspects of the cannabis industry except for cultivation for personal use. You cannot fully prohibit that one activity, but you can adopt regulations to control how it is conducted. So, for example, local jurisdictions can ban personal use cultivation in backyards and open areas. You can confine it to just indoors if you feel it's necessary. So once again, all recreational cannabis activities are temporarily banned while we work out these regulations and we see what the board ultimately adopts, if anything. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to return to the board on November 14th with the amendments to Article 10. And it is right now, it appears that there is interest in just adopting just the amortization regulations, but not the legal non-conforming determination process, which would have required medicinal cultivators to apply for a legal non-conforming determination from your commission, which would be appealable to the board. And that was designed to just allow operators who wanted to operate during this interim period while the regulations, for example, the coastal regulations are under consideration by the Coastal Commission, to get an affirmative decision from the county that says, yes, they're officially legal non-conforming under Article 10, and they can continue operating under that status until the end of the amortization period. That was also found to be possibly useful for enforcement cases, because right now there's about, I can't recall the exact number, it's roughly a little over 20 enforcement cases related to cannabis. And as you're probably well aware, when it comes to enforcement, there are limited tools with which you can take enforcement actions. And in this particular case, because there's no other method by which somebody can get a determination about whether or not they are or are not legal, the only real way to figure out whether or not you truly are legal would be in the sense of somebody filed a violation against you and you went through the violation process and a formal determination would occur that way. Short of that, we don't do anything with regard to these determinations. So.
Mr. Brown, go ahead.
So the question then is, for those applying for these temporary licenses, and the county's going to give them some sort of letter that says they can do this, right, in December. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Okay, well, maybe more nuanced, okay.
Yeah, it has to do with the response for temporary licenses versus the annual licenses.
I understand that, but so then the people who will be able to apply for these temporary licenses are everybody, all the legal non-conforming guys, and the guys who've been just out there doing it not legally? Who's going to be able to do that?
Yeah, so to clarify, Commissioner Chair and Commissioner Brown, so once again, the state intends to start issuing licenses the first of the calendar year. So with regard to the temporary licenses, we're going to be expected to respond to the state when they contact us to notify us that somebody has applied for the state license. That is different from the annual licenses. When the annual licenses are put in effect, we have the option of responding.
I get that.
So what the expectation is, the state contacts us, and then we are to notify them about their standing with regard to our local regulations. So right now, currently, everything's prohibited. So we'd be responding to them saying that, hey, everything's prohibited. And once again, we don't really have a process for determining legal non-conforming status currently. So what the board is considering right now is what should we provide with regard to a response, if any response, and what should that look like? And that is going to be presented and discussed on November 14th. And I see Mr. Bazanich is here, if he would like to add anything to what I have offered.
Thanks, Dan. So, Chair, Commissioners, the temporary licenses will require proactively the provision of a letter of authorization, a license, or a permit to be submitted with the application for the temporary license. We would not be able to provide that at this time because of the existing prohibitions and the lack of a process to do the legal nonconforming determination. So for temporary licenses, that would not be possible for us to provide that proactive documentation. And then Mr. Clement, correctly characterized the process during the interim period is that we would have additional options later on once your commission and the Board of Supervisors considered and approved and adopted a set of licensing ordinances.
So until after this 90-day period, when the permanent one can apply for the permanent licenses, and hopefully the county ordinances are in place, right? 4 months, 120 days. When the ordinances are in place, then all these operators, business people, they sort of get a free pass on, that's my words, not theirs or yours, but that's how I kind of characterize it. They get a pass on sort of complying with any sort of rules. What about state regulations? Are they required to comply with state regulations when they apply to you and you give them your letter? How does that work?
Chair and Commissioner, just clarify, which period are you talking about?
I'm
Which
talking
100
the temporary. For the temporary, when they go to apply for the temporary, you have to give them a letter. But
So as Commissioner and Chair, as I stated a moment ago, we would not be able to provide that letter for the temporary license,
so you're not providing
process.
anything to the state for the temporary?
Correct.
Other than you can't give them anything because...
Correct.
Right, so for that 120 months, they just continue they just continue doing what they're doing, legally or non-conforming legally?
Absent some other enforcement action on a zoning violation, that's correct.
Oh, okay, that's what I'm trying to get my hands around. All right, thank you.
Yeah, and just once again, that is one of the issues that the board is still contending with, and there hasn't been anything officially adopted yet. So we'll have more news after November 14th. Okay, so we have been tasked with developing the local regulations that would complement what's going on at the state. And as you're aware from past updates to your commission, the board formed an ad hoc subcommittee headed by Supervisors Lavanino and Williams to assist staff in developing these regulations and come up with an approach to regulating the cannabis industry here in Santa Barbara County. Given the state's goal of issuing licenses come the 1st of January, we have been hustling to try to get our regulations before the board for consideration as close as possible to January 1st, because we don't want to have a disconnect as much as possible between the state licensing regulations and our local land use and licensing regulations that may be adopted. So what we're currently working on is the land use ordinance amendments, and that also involves local coastal program amendments for the coastal zone. And then the CEO, headed by Mr. Bzanich, is working on a licensing program, and then also an economic analysis that will inform the board's consideration of a possible tax initiative to be put on the tax ballot in June 2018. So there's a number of agencies and departments that have a role in this process, be it in the land use ordinance development or the licensing program. And all of those agencies are also concurrently working on what are going to be the administrative costs associated with whatever comes out of this process in terms of staffing and additional resources that will be required. And once again, that will be discussed starting on November 14th at the board. So on September 19th, we presented the state licenses along with the zones that we are considering allowing cannabis uses that are currently the subject of the environmental impact report, just to get a conceptual read from the board about what their initial thoughts are with regard to what they would like to allow, given a number of unknowns and knowing that this is just conceptual direction. They're not going to come to a conclusion until after the environmental review is completed and your commission, the Montecito Plan Commission, have had an opportunity to consider the ordinance amendments and make a recommendation to them. But in general, there was a fairly robust discussion. Not all the board members provided opinions about all the various licenses and all the zones. So we don't have an exact idea about where consensus was occurring. But generally, there was some consensus. For example, around, for example, in the agricultural zones, there seemed to be support for a certain amount of cultivation. However, they did have some recommendations or things to consider for specific activities on certain ag zone lots, given their location, for example, within proximity to residential uses. And also, in general, there seemed to be support for the various industrial sorts of cannabis activities in the industrial zones, and then retail sales in certain commercial zones. I should say that there were still questions about the appropriateness of retail sales, for example, in mixed-use zones, which have both a commercial and a residential component. And then what I'll get to in a second is there's one license type called a micro business that has a number of components of cannabis activities, and there just wasn't enough known amongst the board about micro businesses, so they asked us to return to give them some more information so that they could opine about that. But once again, I just want to emphasize that that was conceptual direction. The board has a great deal of discretion when determining what may be allowed. Once again, it could be everything that's currently under consideration in the EIR project description to a ban on everything except cultivation for personal use and anything in between those. So,
Commissioner Brown.
So the ordinances that are in the appendix are just based upon what's in the EIR. Those aren't the final ordinances that what's going to come to the Planning Commission. Is that correct?
Commissioner and Chair, Commissioner Brown, that's exactly correct. So the ordinances in the EIR reflect the project description, which is that.
Everything.
Yes.
Yeah, and so how does the refinement occur from those ordinances to what the PCs will see in January?
Good question. So first thing we would do is we got to complete the environmental review because a number of the mitigation measures we'd be recommending as ordinance standards or perhaps policies in the general plan, depending on how the mitigation is written. So we complete the environmental review, and then once again, we intend to present the ordinance amendments to your commission, the Montecito Plan Commission, in January. So for the preparation for those January hearings, we would be drafting an ordinance that reflects whatever recommendation we are making to your commission at that point in time for consideration. So, for example, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that we were going to recommend everything that's under consideration in the EIR. Then we would be presenting something very similar to what is shown in those appendices, but with, for example, the mitigation measures embedded in that. Alternatively, if we were going to be recommending approval of one of the project alternatives, we'll take that existing ordinance and then modify it to reflect that project alternative. So we'd be pulling out the uses that are under consideration for the full project description from that alternative.
So what is going to inform your thinking about the ordinances that we're going to see in January? Is it going to be discussions from the board? Is it going to be discussions from here? Is it going to be public comment on the DEIR? How are you shaping this thing?
All of the above.
All of the above.
All of the above and then some. So, and then also, in addition to just all of the direction we receive from the planning commissions, the board, advisory bodies such as like the Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee, to public comment, to the industry. In addition to all that, there are also those basic statutory requirements that go into any ordinance amendment, not just what applies to cannabis. So we'd be looking at, can you make the findings to say that this is supportive of the public health, safety, and welfare? Is it keeping with good zoning practice? Those sorts of things.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And the other problem is all the state regulations that are going to change between now and then. They seem to be on a daily basis. What the hell?
And I guess the question to follow on from that is, do you expect a lot of changes? I mean, do you have any idea? Do you, it's day by day, moment by moment, huh?
Yeah. Well, really quick, I just say, I'll turn it over to Mr. Buzanich, is that those draft regulations at the end of November, everybody's waiting on those because those will have an impact on how we craft specific requirements, because those are supposed to, once again, complement what's already in the statute but provide a much more detail.
So you may get a lot more detail out of this than what you've got now. Okay.
Chair and Commissioners, I think that's correct. The level of specificity around the regulations about how those statutes are going to be applied to various processes, whether it's the licensing process, application process, anything else, are something we're certainly waiting for. And I would just make note to this commission that with the publication of those emergency regulations in December, what that guarantees is those are not what's going to be the final regulations for this industry. And we're probably looking at a 5, 6, 7, 10-year period as the state of California conducts this licensing operation and experiment, as some have characterized it. Those will continue to change and evolve, and we will have to be responsive on a local level. Ultimately, our goal is to be as consistent with what the state is asking of cannabis businesses, and that we would stay aligned with them to reduce confusion, reduce any incentive to return back to the unlicensed or unregulated marketplace.
Mr. St. John.
Given the really unrealistic schedule that all the cities and counties in the state have been put under, and given that the emergency regs aren't even out yet, is there any movement at the League of Cities or CSAC to the governor's office or to anything that you are aware of to to, as a collective, say, this needs 6 more months or something?
Chair and commissioners, there, at least from CSAC, I haven't paid as close attention to the League of Cities as perhaps maybe others have, but there has not been a concerted effort or a conversation from CSAC about delaying the implementation. Rather, the incentive to the administration and to the regulating agencies has been to, move as quickly as you can to get those regulations out there and published. That said, given the level of local control that is also permitted in the statutes, many of the locales have chosen probably the safe course of putting in place a prohibition on these activities, pending local determinations, as we are considering here, about what to allow, what to not allow, and where to allow it. So I think that permissive or that recognition of local control is certainly a key component of all of these statutes, and most of the local jurisdictions, such as ourselves, have exercised our rights to put in place whatever prohibition for whatever length of time while we develop a final regulatory structure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, not seeing any further questions from commissioners. I want to go to the public comment. I'm going to start. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
Sorry.
Oh, I thought you were. Oh,
you may do that.
Oh,
I mean,
that's great.
but yeah, it's a little bit more to go. It's more just summarizing the environmental analysis at this point. So. Yeah, so the development, particularly the land use ordinance, really started in earnest with the initiation of environmental review. And that began with the publication of a notice of preparation when we determined that an environmental impact report would be required for this project. And that was published from July 12th until August 11th of this year, during which we received about 100 comments that we took into consideration when developing the EIR. And then we hustled with our consultants and completed the draft programmatic EIR and made it available starting on October 2nd. And it's currently in the public comment period, which runs for 45 days. We've received roughly 20 comment letters so far. We anticipate seeing many more by the end of the public comment period. And then pursuant to CEQA, we will provide written responses to those comments that we receive, and those will be included along with the comments in the final EIR. So once again, the draft EIR the project description was purposefully drafted to be very broad, to give as many policy options to the board as possible. So we took a look at all of the activities that are going to be licensed by the state, and they're listed up here. I'd be more than happy to go into detail about any of these. If you have any questions about them, I think they're pretty well explained in the EIR. And then also, we can already see that there are going to be some standards that are going to be applied to cannabis activities that are coming straight out of the statute. So we included those, as well as some others that we saw that were pretty obvious we were going to be recommending be applied if we recommend approval of the cannabis activities based upon what we had been hearing from the public, what little we had received from the board, from our commissions, from the industry, so on and so forth.
Can I just ask you to do a pause right there?
Sure.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Sure, go for it.
Just looking at these development standards in the EIR, they're not real specific, they're not real detailed. Is the plan to come back with ones that are more detailed, with more information? I was going to make some inquiry in some of my comments later after your presentation, but I'm just curious because they're pretty, in my opinion, kind of nebulous, considering what we normally have in development standards for various things like this.
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown. Yeah, so once again, this is a programmatic EIR, so
Right.
it's intended to be not nebulous, but it's supposed to be
loose.
broad in application. So the mitigation measures as they're set forth in the EIR, they will most likely be refined and tweaked when they're translated into ordinance language.
I see.
And then once again, we will also be looking at those mitigation measures plus whatever comes out of the state in terms of implementing regs and try to consolidate those. So there would definitely be more detail provided in the
Okay.
ordinance.
So if we want to try to influence what's in those standards, we should give you a list of items just based upon our experience here with other development standards that are in community plans or that we've seen through our project review.
Well, I think that's the purpose of this item coming before us, is for us to give staff direction and make a recommendation to the board for some of those items.
Well-
I agree with you. I mean, fencing and security, that's a real big issue for me. I don't want kids being able to walk onto some farm and make
Well,
harvest for themselves at 10 o'clock on Friday night, so.
Well, I think also the issue, when I look at your odor abatement plan, it's more about notification than about actual things that need to occur. And it just feels like, considering that's probably the #1 issue for the community, it really needs to be tightened up and really good development standards and.
That's a really great example, actually, as to why we purposely don't provide the level of detail at this point in time. So,
Okay.
for example, depending on the type of cannabis activity, the type of
Elsewhere.
odor
I see.
abatement will differ. So, for example, what may work very well for a greenhouse operation will be ineffective for an open field grow. So,
No, I understand that, but it's also the issue of to what activity it's going to be applied, and
Absolutely.
I mean, if I was reading the City of Denver's, I mean, they've got 20 pages worth of odor abatement plan here, and I know you're not going to go to that extent, but you're going to go to some extent other than what's in the EIR. I'm hoping.
Sure.
Right. Okay.
Another thing to consider too is that technology has evolved too. So, for example, from conversations I've had with some representatives from the industry who operate greenhouses, some of them have some of the best odor control that was available at the time in which they
Changes.
initiated their medicinal cultivation activities. But since that time, there's actually better technology
Right.
out there. So we want to be able to be flexible too, so that the
Flexible,
operators
right.
can bring that on when it becomes
And
available.
is it going to apply to all cannabis activities?
Not necessarily, only those activities which are found to result in the impact, because we
And-
have to have that nexus to impose
Right.
that
And do you know which
requirement.
ones those are at the moment, other than cultivation?
It's mostly cultivation, and then wherever you are storing large quantities of it, that can produce odors. But really, after cultivation, when you process it and you package it, the odor problems tend to cease at that point.
Okay. So it's the manufacturing piece?
It's
or
it's
the
basically
distribution?
cultivation to the point in which it's processed, dried, cured,
We don't know. Okay.
packaged, or manufactured. That's when you see the
All right, thank
most
you. Thank you.
distinct odors. Okay, I don't expect you to be able to read this table. This is coming straight out of the EIR. It's on page 2-36, but it's intended to just give you an idea of how the EIR project description was set up and the considerations that went into it. So,
All right, before you go any further, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, but I've spent a lot of time and I've
Go.
talked to Dan about some of these issues already. Do you want us to jump in and start discussing this now, or do you want to wait till he finishes his presentation?
I'd like to wait till he finishes
Okay.
his
All right,
presentation.
and we'll come back to that. Thank you.
thank you. So just to explain how the uses were organized. So on the left-hand column, we have the zones that are under consideration for the various cannabis activities. As you will see, those are not all of the zones in the county, because clearly there are some zones where the basic purpose and objective of the zone does not accommodate cannabis activity. So for example, residential zones or resource protection zones are inappropriate for industrial manufacturing sorts of uses. So those were excluded. And then the other columns list all of the various license types that the state will be issuing for the various cannabis activities, and they're generally cultivation, manufacturing, testing, retail sales, distribution, and microbusiness. And microbusiness is an interesting one because it's actually a combination of cultivation, non-volatile manufacturing, and then retail sales and distribution, but it excludes testing. And the testing license is probably the most unique license in the sense that if you hold a testing license, you cannot hold any of the other licenses. The reason being is that you're supposed to be an objective you're supposed to perform an objective assessment of the quality control for cannabis. So that would be the one license that would be unique, and if you hold one of those, that's the only one you have. But the other licenses, the state encourages local jurisdictions to consider integrating multiple licenses on sites to have vertical integration, as it's called, for a number of reasons, for safety, security, also for environmental reasons. And then I will say also, last thing, on the bottom row here just sums up, if the various cannabis activity was allowed in all the zones indicated in the table, what's the total amount of acreage in the county in which you could possibly see these uses? And this is obviously going to be a very high estimate because it's just taking at a very gross level all of the lands that have that zoning designation, regardless of the current physical condition of those properties, whether or not there's existing development. It's a worst case scenario, so to speak. So.
You know, Dan, would have been helpful if you had a column to the right that showed for each of the individual zone districts how much land. In other words, if it's 2 acres or 10, because it's, as you said, it's, the number is sort of deceiving because it's not really, there's not really 671,000 acres available for some of these activities. So a column to the right, if you have that information by for each of the particular, you know, C3, C2, C1.
Yeah, it's true. The reason why we take this approach is because this is a programmatic EIR involving rules changes. We don't have a specific development proposal before us. We cannot say with certainty where cannabis activities will occur in the future, given that these rules will change in the fashion that we're proposing. So, for example, there's nothing precluding somebody who currently owns an Ag 1 zoned land. Let's assume that cannabis cultivation is allowed on their property. They could currently be doing some other type of agricultural activity, or there could be a portion of their property that's currently not in cultivation, but with the adoption of these regulations, they decide they want to embark on cannabis cultivation. There's nothing preventing them from planting that crop where they had previous crops, or going into a new area where they previously had not conducted agricultural activities. Similar for the other types of businesses, you could have a multi-tenant building that you lease out to individuals for retail businesses, and then a new cannabis business approaches you and says, hey, I want to start this activity, and I'll pay you that much more than your current tenants just so I can have it, because this is the one area where I need to be. And there's nothing preventing a property owner from, allowing that new tenant to come in.
I think what Commissioner Brown was asking for was just to give us, by example, 100,000 square feet of Ag 1, 200,000 square feet of Ag 2, 50,000 square feet of C1 in that last column.
Okay.
So we would know how much is available in each one of those.
Yeah, or even just the number of parcels. How many C1 parcels are there? Not many in the county, I don't think.
I just didn't have the footage myself. Makes
Yeah, or
sense.
the
Acreage.
whatever you've got. I mean, in CS, there's nothing. In shopping centers, most of these you're very limited, except for the Ag. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good comments. All right, so I just have a few maps which provide examples of areas in which cannabis activities are currently under consideration in the EIR. So this is an example of a map. It shows the Los Alamos area. Generally, the green area are ag zones, is ag zoned land, which could accommodate cannabis cultivation. And then you can see within Los Alamos, the beige area indicates primarily residential zoned land. So on those lands, no activities would be allowed, except, once again, cultivation for personal use, which we cannot fully prohibit. But then we've identified the commercial zones and, in this case, mixed use zones, which could allow cannabis activities, provided that the project description in the EIR is approved. We also show industrial zone lands in gray, and then the professional and institutional lands shown in blue. So similarly, for San Ynez Valley, the majority of the area is dominated by agriculture. So the type of activity you'll see predominantly out there, provided that the project's approved, would be cultivation. And then there are some limited areas in San Ynez Valley that have commercial zoning, and then the PI zoning as well, where the other sorts of activities could occur. A small amount of industrial zone land next to Solvang as well.
Dan, just while we're here, something but I've asked Ms. Fogg to answer is about the San Ynez MU zone overlay. And perhaps she can answer that now, because it's not in your tables. It's not in your, whether or not you're proceeding with that or not, it's being excluded. What's happening to that?
Well, when we looked at that, the underlying zones where the overlay is were C1, C2, C3, I believe. And so only the uses that would otherwise be allowed in those zones, those commercial zones, would also be allowed per the overlay. So we determined that the overlay, although it also gives mixed use allowances, it doesn't change what would be shown in that matrix that Dan showed you.
Okay, but there's other considerations, because if it is, okay, I'll get into
Certainly.
that later. Okay,
it
I
could
get
be
it.
further limited through the
I get it.
recommended.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, appreciate it.
All right, and this map just shows the Isla Vista area. This one's kind of unique because so much of the land surrounding Isla Vista is occupied by the university, and the university does have preschools, daycare facilities on their campus for grad students, faculty, and staff. And because of the setback requirements from youth serving facilities like daycare facilities, actually there's quite a bit of land in Isla Vista that would be prohibited from cannabis activities, because the setback from a youth serving facility is measured from the property line to the property line. So, and because the campus is a very large property and a daycare facility could be located anywhere on that property, it actually ends up excluding quite a bit of Isla Vista. So what is not shown here are the 600-foot buffers, but you can imagine a 600 buffer along the east side of Isla Vista, and would cut off some of the commercial zoned lands here along the Embarcadero Loop. So once again, these are worst case scenarios, not taking into account any sort of development standards, setbacks, anything like that. This is just where it could possibly be allowed, holding all else equal. Just another example, here's a map of the Eastern Goleta Valley. It's has a little bit more activity in terms of, at least in the north, you have opportunity for cultivation on ag zone lands, and primarily along the Hollister Avenue, State Street corridor, where there was quite a bit of rezoning done as part of the Eastern Goleta Valley Community Plan update. We do have a number of commercially zoned properties where, once again, cannabis activities could be allowed.
But those buffers are going to apply there in a big way.
That's correct.
Have you done all the buffer maps for all these zone districts? All these planning areas, or you have those?
Yes, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, we have run buffer maps. However, they're limited in the sense that we have GIS layers which show, for example, all public schools, all licensed daycare facilities. Obviously, we know where a number of parks and other certain types of youth-serving facilities are located. But when it comes specifically to privately run youth-serving facilities, we don't have that information readily available. What we are intending, or what we foresee, is that, once again, if cannabis is allowed, if somebody were to come in and apply for the entitlement and license, we would at that point in time run a buffer to see what is located within proximity to the proposed cannabis location, to see if any of those youth-serving facilities exist. And once again, that would involve more research than what we currently have available in our GIS layers. So we'd be doing that analysis at that point in time.
So is there any detriment to not sort of having that information up front in considering the buffers and what is allowed where? I'm just trying to kind of think this through, because I've given to Jessica a couple places in Eastern Goleta Valley, which, you know, the trampoline place and shopping center, and there's some other dance studios and stuff like that. Because I think what it does, it shows to decision makers there's less area to site retail stores than what you would normally, or whatever other activities you're going to have, than what you see here, and that may drive some consideration about putting other kinds of uses in other kinds of zone districts in other places. I don't know, I'm just, anyway.
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I characterize it as detrimental, but I would say it's definitely a factor to consider when looking at what is the realistic scale of cannabis activities in the county. Just a very small tangent. You know, one thing we grappled with as on the ad hoc committee is that there's already a very limited amount of unincorporated area that has industrial or commercial zoning which could accommodate these uses. So after you factor in these standards that would apply, plus the regulatory requirements and just the cost of operating this industry, there's some significant hurdles to successfully operating in this industry, so in unincorporated areas. So we want to embrace the industry as much as we can, but we're doing that in the context of planning principles and the direction the county has gone, at least in the past. So.
What you say, John?
Following up on Commissioner Brown's question, I would like to get copies of the buffer maps because I think they will help all of us make decisions, realizing they're imperfect with giant footnotes in bold that says this doesn't include unlicensed daycare facilities and others that may have not be in our database or as of a certain date. But I agree with Commissioner Brown that it starts to cabin the areas where this ordinance where the things would apply, and then we can focus on the areas that are left.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to provide those at upcoming.
And I'll just make comment. That being said, I don't mind that occurring, but I question its usefulness. I clearly understand having the ordinance talk about not being within a certain distance of children serving facilities. The problem with trying to map it now and quantify it is what happens if I place a new one someplace else 6 months from now? It's not on your radar. I open up a new daycare center. It's more important to have the ordinance specify that you as a staff will, when they make an application, will do your circle map and determine what is there. And it needs to be codified that way because what's there today is not the same thing that'll be there 6 months or a year from now. I know there's a strip joint, I don't know what you call it, in the city of Santa Maria, and unfortunately the daycare for the church got put in 6 months too later. It wouldn't be there, so it's like.
Well, I think the point is that, and I think it's Commissioner St. John's point, is that it's helpful to kind of look at this thing globally. We understand there's going to be changes over time, and staff is still going to take a look. The map is not, it's not static. It'll be dynamic as you move along.
I just wonder.
I think they already have one for this area.
Yeah,
I know Jessica's already made one, so you may have one for others.
If you have time in your work program to do that, I don't care. It's not important to me, is all I'm saying.
We've actually
more important we have the rules.
We've done the majority of the work. It won't be very much effort just to publish those.
Continue.
Okay, so very quickly, the draft EIR is broad in its analysis, in fact, of all of the typical issue areas that are evaluated in an initial study. The only issue area that was not evaluated because there clearly were not going to be any impacts was with regard to mineral resources. So I'm not going to go through all of these. If you have any questions, particularly after you get through more of the EIR, I'd be more than happy to answer those as part of future updates. But just some of the main conclusions of the EIR real quickly. There were unavoidably significant Class 1 impacts that were identified. And these are impacts where after applying all the feasible mitigation measures, the impacts remain significant. And in order to approve the project, given that these environmental effects would occur, the Board of Supervisors would have to adopt what's called a Statement of Overriding Considerations, which sets forth the public benefits or the good from the project, which outweighs those environmental impacts. So very quickly, the EIR identified at a cumulative level Class 1 impacts with regard to aesthetics and visual resources. There were also impacts identified with regard to agricultural resources, specifically with regard to the conversion of ag soils. We're anticipating that there would be new, for example, greenhouse development that would result from this industry that would permanently convert ag soils to non-agricultural use. With regard to air quality, there were a few different Class 1 impacts identified. What was interesting is that, for example, with the county's clean air plan and the, I'm going to get the exact wording probably incorrect, but it's the supplement to the county's land use element for air quality. And in those plans, there were certain projections, economic forecasts, population forecasts that were set forth, and it never anticipated a cannabis industry being established in Santa Barbara County. So when you factor in this new industry and the employment projections, it exceeds those projections, and that was considered to be significant impact. And then obviously odors are a big issue with cannabis, and due mainly to the fact that there's only so much you can do with outdoor grows with regard to odor control. It's inevitable that if you're going to allow, for example, outdoor grows, you're going to have smell odors, and they're going to be smelled by somebody. So the EIR takes a very conservative approach and states that because we cannot control all those odors down to a level where people can't smell it, it conservatively concludes that the impacts would be unavoidably significant. Similarly, with noise and transportation and traffic due primarily to increase in traffic levels, the EIR concludes that you would see an unavoidably significant impact with regard to increases in noise as well as congestion and vehicle miles traveled. In addition, the EIR identifies a number of impacts that would be significant, but after applying feasible mitigation to those impacts, it reduces those impacts to a less than significant level. These are also called Class 2 impacts. Those are listed here. I'm not going to go into those in any detail, but of course, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer those.
While you're on that topic, I just want to get some general background because we don't seem to be getting general background like the board does. So my question is for these the Class 1 and Class 2 for the visual resources, what kind of development is envisioned on ag land? Is it open grows, greenhouses, hoop houses, or are you envisioning other newly built structures? What is being contemplated?
All of the above was considered because those are all possibilities that could result from the adoption of these regulations.
Okay, so then if it's all of the above, then the way any development standards are written have to be for all of the above. Because I'm thinking, if you have a greenhouse and you need, or if you have a structure, a newly built structure, do you need a fence around it?
So I would say, Commissioner Brown, the impacts, the way they're evaluated, they're more in terms of the license types, the activities. So, for example, the way it was analyzed, so they would,
Right.
the consultants, for example, took cultivation activities and said, okay, what are the aesthetic impacts from cultivation? Then they looked at manufacturing, retail, distribution. What would result from the, the activities and development that would be involved with that, and then they craft mitigation based upon those specific activities. So, for example, odor control is much more important for outdoor, greenhouses as compared to distribution, or, so the mitigation is going to be based more upon the activity rather than the license type or something like that.
Yeah, I get that, but what I'm having trouble because is reading this section and trying to be helpful in crafting proposed standards for development, because it's very broad and it's very general about, you need a screening plan, a landscape plan. Well, we don't do screening plans and landscape plans for hoop houses that are growing raspberries. Okay, so we might need security fencing because that's part of the state regs, I believe. Okay, so then what about lighting? Are we lighting the outsides of these structures, or is just the inside? What is, so, because I don't know, I have no idea about any of this. I don't know how we can be responsive in providing standards for these guys to adhere to or to be reviewed.
Well, I think that's the process we're going through. For example, could we not have a prohibition against all open growing? And we could have a standard that says you will all be in greenhouses, you'll all be secure, you'll all have odor controls in the greenhouses, and you're not allowed to cultivate in an open field. That's one of the possibilities, but that's what we're going to look at.
I know, but the problem is you need to know this before you discuss it.
No, that's what the EIR is all about. It's going to list all these different problems and possible concerns, and we're going to craft the regulations, to mitigate those to the greatest extent possible, which may be a prohibition against certain kinds of activities.
Well, let me just say, I'm going to differ with you, Commissioner Blau, because I have read the EIR and I've read this particular section pretty carefully, and it's rather confusing to me about what might be required for what particular activity, because I think you could do distribution in a big greenhouse. I'm thinking maybe we've got some cannabis operators here and they can discuss that. So I just need more information, and to me, the EIR doesn't specifically address each of these kinds of activity, each of these kinds of operations. I get the hoop house thing. Okay, that's pretty clear, but that's why I'm kind of grappling with this of how do I say, well, the fencing plan is, anyway.
One thing I would encourage you to consider when you're reading the EIR is that, once again, this is programmatic EIR, and because we don't have a specific development proposal before us, you can't get down to the level of specificity it sounds like you're trying to get to. So this is, the programmatic EIR mitigation measures are really supposed to set forth the standard, the benchmark that you're supposed to meet, and then it generally describes how you do that. So for example, lighting, it's going to state what standards you need to meet in your lighting in terms of, you know, no spillover onto another property, make sure it's shielded, fully controlled, so it's projected downward onto the property, things like that. Now, we can't state for every given location how you're going to achieve that. So what we are going to be, what we would do is when somebody applied for their permit, we would then say, okay, show us your lighting plan which achieves these standards, and then we would evaluate that specific lighting plan to see whether or not it meets those standards. When it comes to things like aesthetics and screening, we'd be relying partially on the BAR review process to get their input about, okay, is this landscaping sufficient to screen the facility to meet the standard that is set forth in the EIR and would become an ordinance standard.
So that process is envisioned, that if they need a screening plan through whatever regulatory review you do, that it'll go through BAR for a screening plan, a landscape plan, a fencing plan, a lighting. Wow.
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, yes. Wow. Once again, all of the activities, as you saw on that chart, would require at least a land use permit, if not a conditional use permit. So the purpose of requiring those entitlements is to ensure that any specific facility meets those standards. So
I think we're going to call this ordinance the Planning Commission Full Employment Act. Continue.
Okay, very quick. This is the last part, and I'll wrap up with just some upcoming events. But one other requirement of CEQA for EIRs is that we evaluate project alternatives. We always have to look at the no project alternative and then evaluate a reasonable range of alternatives. So what we crafted with input from the ad hoc and others were 3 alternatives in addition to the no project alternative. The first one being an alternative which would exclude all of the activities that are currently under consideration on Ag 1 properties. The second alternative evaluates what would things look like if we were to not allow the activities that are under consideration on lands that are subject to Williamson Act or Land Conservation Act contracted lands. And then finally, we drafted an alternative that effectively reduces the kind of the maximum number of participants and activity that was estimated to occur in the EIR. And that was based upon a registry, which I didn't mention earlier in this presentation, that was headed by the CEO, whereby we asked those who were considering operating in the cannabis industry, what are you envisioning, where are you envisioning your operations, and a number of other questions to which they mostly provided responses to inform the environmental review and the economic analysis. So what we did is we looked at throwing out some outliers which were fairly unrealistic in the registry. The EIR consultant said, okay, assuming that all these people were given the opportunity to conduct what they would like to do, what would that universe look like? So we took that number, we cut it in half, and then we came up with alternative 3, reduced registrants. And what we found is alternative 3 is the environmentally superior alternative. That's what one of the other components that we're required to do as part of the EIR, that is identify which one is environmentally superior. So the only other thing I'd say with regard to the alternatives analysis is this project is unique in the sense that I'd say for most EIRs, you're not looking or evaluating or assuming that illegal activity would occur. You're assuming people comply with the law. But this is one of those projects where it's fairly safe to say that you are going to continue to see a certain amount of illegal activity regardless of what regulations the board adopts. So with regard to the no project alternative, there's much more discussion about, hey, you are going to continue to see at least a certain level of black market activity out there. How would that affect the environment? So that was a little different with this EIR.
So with alternative 3, are you envisioning that, does this mean that there's only going to be a certain number of licenses permitted, and a certain amount of acreage? So some of these guys who've applied thinking I'm going to be able to do this are going to be not going to do it. Are they going to go do it illegally or whatever? I don't know.
Yes, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown. Yeah, you could achieve it either one of those ways, but it's The licensing aspect of the cannabis industry affords us more authority to place restrictions on who and where, I'd say, this could occur. So it would most likely occur through a licensing sort of program where you'd say, okay, we're only going to issue X amount of all of these various licenses. And you would see how that plays out, and then you would adjust those levels accordingly.
And so is there any preference? So is there sort of a preference given to people who've been legal non-conforming, or the good actors over the bad actors? I mean, how do you make
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, that is still up to the discretion of the board. They could do that. They could prioritize those who registered. They could choose not to. It's really up to them.
One of the things I haven't seen yet, which I'm sure you'll get to, is the cost of obtaining planning approval for this kind of an operation. CUP, PD permit, what you're going to do. And here what I see is the really difficult part for the board, and that is you're going to tax it, we're going to fee it to death in order for it to occur. This county can't do anything less than a year, can't do anything less for $50,000. So, I mean, if that's the case, you're going to see a lot more illegal activity because no one's going to have the wherewithal to go through that pain and suffering. So are we going to see a typical project and what it would cost and how long it would take in order for it to be legal in the county of Santa Barbara?
Commissioner Chair, we could possibly provide that to you as part of future updates, given, once again, there are a whole lot of unknowns right now. But in general, you did see on that chart, it's either going to be a land use permit or a conditional use permit. So we would not be charging a different rate than we would for other types of land use permits or conditional use permits for other types of uses. So it'd be full cost recovery, be charged on an hourly basis. And what we're anticipating is that initially it's going to take a bit as we go through the learning curve on issuing these things. And then eventually, though, things will smooth out and we'll develop a more streamlined process. But that's our intent right now. So when it comes to the economic implications of that, we're not prepared today to talk about that. Once again, that's going to be coming up later, November 14th.
I think at some point in the future, we'd like to, I mean, I'm pretty sure Mr. Brown, and especially I'd like to see how you envision that process, how long you think it's going to take, and give you some idea what the fees are going to be.
Sure.
Because quite frankly, if it's too cumbersome and too expensive, I'm probably not going to recommend that the board do that, because that's going to defeat the whole purpose of trying to get these things licensed under control, as opposed to what we see today in the black market. Do I see you have a comment?
So, Chair and Commissioners, this is a utmost concern, I think, from the subcommittee process that we went through all the way through the staff discussions now that are occurring. And to be honest, as Mr. Klenman just mentioned, the fee structure we're imagining is no different than any other land use permit on the permitting side. Licensing, we're restricted to only do full cost recovery, nothing more than that for the licensing, but that should be fairly inexpensive, frankly, because it's some time for on-site inspections and those kinds of things to make sure they're complying with the terms of their license. The state will be doing a similar kind of process for the state agencies. And then just so you know, on the taxation side, the state has already, in a sense, already codified their pound of flesh, if you will, in terms of the taxation structure for this industry. That has put a challenge on all of us in local government to create a tax structure that does not push people back into the unregulated marketplace due to cumbersome and unwieldy taxes and fees. And so we really are challenged by that, and yet we're going to proceed under the assumption that we can and will bring to the voters a proposal for a tax measure to deal with the unregulated market as well. But again, we've got limits, and the state has already stated what their taxes are, and so we got to look at that from a financial perspective of how do we make sure people are incentivized to be in the regulated market.
Yeah, and I think I made this comment last time, and I'll make it again. You just need to make sure that you look back to the Al Capone days, and you want to create a penalty for not paying the county tax on the unregulated market that puts them in jail. And I think that's going to do more to well, I think it worked well for the IRS and put Al Capone away. But at any rate, that's another comment. So do we have more? Go ahead.
Really quick, I'm just going to wrap things up here. So just to give everyone a heads up of the remaining events between now and the anticipated end of this program development is that, once again, on November 14th, we're going to be having the board hearing where there could be a number of important issues presented to the board, everything from Article 10 amendments to enforcement options to first look at economic implications. And then on November 15th, I'll be providing another update to the Montecito Planning Commission. And then once again on November 16th, the public comment period for the EIR ends, and we will be racing to prepare the documents for presentation to the Planning Commissions in January, and then ultimately present the Planning Commission's recommendations to the board in February. So as close to January 1st as we could get, given when we started. And then from February until June of next year, Mr. Bazanch will be taking the lead on developing the tax ballot measure to be placed on the June 2018 tax ballot. And then we're anticipating, given how quickly Coastal Commission staff processes LCP amendments these days, that Coastal Commission would be considering certification in May, June 2019. So therein, you can see that lag period for those in the coastal zone, particularly in Carpinteria. So with that said, we're more than happy to answer whatever questions or comments you may have. We have a number of opportunities too for people to sign up and become involved and hear the updates and attend the upcoming workshops and hearings, and those are all up here. And yeah, I'd be more than happy to answer whatever additional questions you may have.
Great. I'm not seeing you. We're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and when we come back from that, we'll take public comment.
This is him on the other line. I'm going to talk with him and have him call you
Right after this.
That's the only reason I'm here.
I know, when we get done with this. That's coming up. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start our public comment. I'm going to start in Santa Maria with Linda Tunnell.
Chairman, Commissioners, my name is Linda Tunnell, and I live in Tepesca Canyon.
I need you to pull the microphone a little closer to you and to talk a little louder if you could.
Thank you.
Thank you, much better.
We recommend alternate 1. Not only does it remove Tepesca Canyon from the project area, but other sensitive areas of Santa Barbara County. I would also like to submit the following for you to exempt Tepesca Canyon from the area of eligibility of the proposed ordinance. Tepesca Canyon's existing rural neighborhood is unique in being the only area of the county with tailored planning policies in the comprehensive plan land use element, designed to prevent inappropriate development in the area. This is a recognition of the severe constraints in this area that trumps provisions of the Land Use and Development Code, since the comprehensive plan is the highest order planning document for the county. Primary goal of the comprehensive plan agricultural element is the expansion and intensification of agriculture in areas, and I quote, where conditions allow, taking into account environmental impacts for such expansion. This is clear policy direction to be aware of cultivation or conversion of lands such as Tepesca Canyon, where there are severe geologic and environmental constraints. Since most of Tepesca Canyon is already mapped as an existing developed rural neighborhood, it is already recognized as a matter of policy that this is a residential neighborhood that is more sensitive to land use changes than ordinary rural lands. Thank you.
Thank you. And next will be Pat Hansen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine, thank you.
Okay, good morning. Excuse me. I live at the 6-mile marker on Tepeske Road. There is a cannabis farm next door to me and several more within a 2-mile radius of my home. Altogether, there are around 30 cannabis farms on Tepeske Canyon Road and none currently has a permit to operate legally. It's fairly obvious that the growers chose our area for the topography, which offers complete privacy. Almost all of the illegal activity is not visible from the main road. The draft environmental impact report clearly states that Tepeske Canyon is unsuitable for cannabis farming. At least legalization has focused attention on the growing side of the issue. But despite calling the sheriff's attention to the rapidly expanding illegal activity in Tepeske Canyon, there's been no enforcement of the law. We're told there's no funding available, that their hands are tied. The canyon has one way in and one way out, so enforcement could be easily accomplished. You propose using part of the taxes and fees paid by the growers for enforcement purposes, but there's no guarantee that they will apply for permits. They would be subjected to inspections, fees, taxes, and penalties. So what is the incentive? Currently, everything they do is paid for with cash, and none of their income can be tracked. So how will the county make money from them? Please do not grant permits for Tepeske Canyon and deal with what is already here. Our quality of life is being destroyed and our rights as citizens ignored. We want action on enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. David Clary.
Morning. I suspect some of the commissioners feel as nervous as we do about understanding this draft program EIR. I printed it out, and my PDF file says it's 608 pages. So you can say, okay, these are just single, one page printed on each sheet. So this almost 3-inch file is not really represented. So let's count words. It's 50,000 more words than Moby Dick. So this is an enormous file. We haven't had enough time to absorb it, and I sense the same kind of nervousness among the commissioners about this problem. We've had too little time to deal with this, and I've raised a motion that it actually reaches the level of a denial of due process. So, but I'm sorry, I didn't start at the beginning. My name is Dave Clary. I live in Tepeske Canyon. My comments, my organized comments here, are going to deal with the draft EIR. And in that, the draft program EIR of October 2017 makes the following statement, summarized here because of its length, that there will be illegal cultivation going on for the foreseeable future in the remote rural areas of the county. This would certainly include Tepeske Canyon. That the illegal growers are likely to eventually move to counties that have different or weaker enforcement, like Mendocino County, etc. There is no effective enforcement now in Santa Barbara County, so we hear laugh about that. So why would they move to another county? These two statements are repeated 6 times in the draft EIR. I'll cite the pages, page 12, page 100, page 530. These are references to the PDF numbers. Page 547, page 563, page 573. Once again, 12, 100, 530, 547, 563, 573. Combined, these two statements tell those of us who reside in Tepeske Canyon that you are now and forever giving, at least this is the recommendation, giving up on us in terms of enforcement regarding illegal growing. This is a powerful message you are giving to the illegal growers in Tepesquay Canyon and the county. How far and wide will this announcement go? It is naive to think that this is just local. I don't mean to insult anybody, it's just and so how many additional illegal marijuana growers will it encourage to open business in the remote rural areas of Santa Barbara County, including Tepesquay Canyon? Now, let's look at the comparison made with Mendocino County, made in the draft PEIR. I understand that the 3,500 square miles of rugged landscape in Mendocino County is hard to police. However, Tepesquay Canyon has one way in and one way out. There is its territory is 2% the size of Mendocino County, 2%. There is absolutely no excuse for giving up on active enforcement against illegal marijuana commercial cultivation in Tepesquay Canyon. We ask that you encourage the Board of Supervisors to change the laws to make a violation of an ordinance a wobbler, so that misdemeanor charges can be filed against illegal growers rather than endless letters citing infractions for which there is no effective remedy. Make sure that any local taxes on marijuana include a substantial funding of enforcement activities. In other states, the problem quite often is there's not enough money for enforcement. So join us in supporting amendments to SB 94 at the state level that would provide effective funding for enforcement of the tough state cannabis tax laws. I heard a comparison to the Al Capone days. I've been thinking of that myself. So I read these tax laws in this SB 94, and it gives tremendous powers to the state, the tax collection division for the Cannabis Authority with respect to enforcement. However, the amount of funding to go to that is for the total administration of the cannabis laws and for collection, which I understand to interpret as enforcement, but there's nothing else regarding enforcement there, is 4% of all the tax revenues that come into the state from cannabis. That's totally wrong. And we are certainly going to talk to our representatives, and we would ask for your support in this. So you can give the state support in giving the state, who gets 15% of the legal cannabis activities, part of the power to actually help enforce it. Taking some of the burden off us.
Thank you, Mr. Clary. I need you to conclude. Thank you.
And us, the county. I'm sorry, time. I apologize. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Commissioner Blau. Mr. Clary.
Mr. Clary, Commissioner Brown has a question for you.
Sure. Go ahead.
Mr. Clary, you think you only had 608 pages of the EIR. There are the technical appendices, which I recommend you look at, because that's where the draft ordinances are, and some land use tables, and where the public comments are, which are sometimes very informative and helpful to read when you're reviewing the EIR. So there's more than 608 pages to the whole document anyway.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Thank you. Next be Lil Clary.
We did not hear the name of the next speaker.
Lil Clary. And she'll be followed by Tim Bennett. That's what my last speaker slip for Santa Maria.
My name is Lil Clary. I'm a 20-year resident of Tepesquay Canyon, and I'm a member of the Tepesquay Canyon Crisis Committee, which is absolutely opposed to commercial cannabis operations in our community. Last week, 18 Canyon residents attended the open meeting on the PEIR, and 10 of us spoke directly to issues raised therein. Today, I'd like to make 2 points. First, our mountainous region is identical to Goleta, Gaviota, and Toro Canyons. Look at the PEIR, where it uses the same descriptive language about fire danger and inadequate road structure. How can the county imagine it would be appropriate to permit commercial cannabis operations in Tepesquay given those statements? Second, I'm sure that the Planning Commission supervisors and county staff understand that enforcement is one of the key issues we have to deal with. Currently, the reactive, that is complaint-driven process using infractions to control illegal grows is totally inadequate. Your staff write letters, the growers evade. Your staff write additional letters, the growers continue to evade. And eventually the growers give up and say, all right, you have permission to come on the property, but that permission is withheld until the grow has been harvested and signs of the activity have been removed. You need to insist, as my husband commented, that misdemeanors instead of infractions apply to the violations. Finally, our safety and our environment are both under attack here. Please note that Proposition 64 stated that the processes used to implement legalization would protect the safety of citizens and the environment. I'm certainly not seeing that here. Tepiscay has endured 3 years of increasing numbers of cannabis grows, despite the nearly 2-year-old countywide moratorium. We are tired of being collateral damage as the county tries to capture tax revenue from cannabis while ignoring our issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Bennett?
Yes, good morning. Tim Bennett. I live at the 10.7 mile marker. Just one simple thing to say. Tepiscay Road and infrastructure cannot safely support commercial use of this kind. Please take Tepiscay Canyon out of this plan. By the way, prohibition without enforcement does nothing.
Thank you. And we'll return to Santa Barbara. Willie Hoppy.
Good morning. My name is Vilja Hape, and I've been farming in the Carpinteria Valley for almost 30 years. I do want to comment that staff did a terrific job on their presentation of the EIR. I'm talking to you about Alternative 2, preclusion of cannabis activities from the Williamson Act land. I remember my feeling of pride 28 years ago when I applied for and received Williamson Act designation for my farms. It made me proud to do my share preserving agriculture in Carpinteria. It was about 15 years ago, through my membership with California Women for Agriculture, that I found out that not all counties in California adopted the Williamson Act. And it made me even more aware how special Santa Barbara County is in helping property owners preserve agriculture. Never ever did I think I would have to stand here in front of you clarifying the right to grow any agriculture crop on Williamson Act land. The state of California, California Department of Food and Agriculture, has decided that cannabis is an agriculture crop, like broccoli and orchids. Therefore, Alternative 2, as mentioned in the EIR, is a mute item. In my eyes, it is not correct for the county to want to dictate what crops a farmer may grow when his or her land is under the Williamson Act contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Kowalski.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners, and staff. My name is Paul Kowalski, and I'm here to talk about a couple of things. First, you mentioned a letter regarding legal nonconforming when technically there is no legal nonconforming status. However, there have been a number of businesses that have had county inspections and had the violation closed. I would like to recommend that one of the letters that you're able to draft says that they have had an inspection and have had the violation closed and are in compliance to the county's knowledge. That would help reduce burden and workload on the staff since work has already been done at that point. Secondly, I would support the EIR and propose the no project alternative and recommend that you focus on mitigation of nuisance issues and the ability for businesses to comply and operate effectively within the county. The third thing is regarding the micro business. I support the micro business. It's historically been the model by which the medical marijuana industry has operated. And I don't understand why that small, limited category would have a conditional use permit associated with it. So I would like to see the conditional use permit removed from that category, as it places an undue burden on the smaller businesses, and would prefer to see ordinances whereby the permitting process goes through the county and mirrors the ordinances and doesn't require an additional layer of work and burden and cost, such as a conditional use permit. Thank you.
Commissioner Brown has a question.
Are you on, you're in carp?
Yes.
You're on egg?
Yes.
Egg 1?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
John Sashenko?
Hello, Chair, Commissioners, and staff. Thank you for your presentation on the draft EIR. I think everyone's doing a really good job at dealing with this issue right now, which is full of uncertainties, and still waiting on the state to give us the final regulations. I would like to, echo what Paul and Willia said about, we shouldn't look at limiting the Williamson Act land, as well as we shouldn't look at limiting the Ag 1-2 zoning. I feel that it is important to stay with that Williamson Act contract of being able to grow any deemed agricultural crop on that land to preserve the agriculture. One thing, just a little bit of a background I'm a farmer in Carpinteria as well, and I've been working together with a sister farm in San Luis Obispo that has been working with the RCD up there, and Devin Best. And I recommend any questions with the EIR and conservation work to talk to the RCD in San Luis Obispo and work with the RCD here in Santa Barbara so that we can work through them also on data collection to continue filling out our conservation efforts. The sister farm I've been working with in San Luis Obispo has been working with the RCD for many years. It's been working with UC Davis for 10 years, the World Wildlife Foundation, Audubon Society, Fish and Wildlife, Stream & Field. They have active studies on their cannabis farm for 10 years showing rainbow trout populations, salamanders, frogs, bears, pumas. They have all of the studies done to show that there is no environmental impact or beneficial environmental impact, seeing as how their ranch is the only ranch that has a native rainbow trout population on their creek. So I'd like to see those efforts move forward. One other question, and to echo what Paul has said, is that Dan said earlier on that the only real way to determine if someone is a legal operator or not is if there's been a complaint filed against them and if they've gone through a review process. Through that review process, if there's an enforcement action determination showing that their case is closed, then that is the only way to show that they are legal. I would like to recommend that those people who have had these enforcement action determinations done for their farms, that they have the ability to get that in some form of writing from the county to present to the state for temporary licensing. Yeah, that would be it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Barbara Close.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Close from the Eastern Galita Valley, and in looking over, scanning over the draft EIR, there's a couple of things that I'm concerned about. One is that, and we've been talking about this for a really long time, even at the Board of Supervisors meeting, why mixed use is considered a place where the cannabis industry can operate. Because in our community plan, which we've spent years on, mixed use is considered residential, and it is clearly designated that residential is not going to be where cannabis is allowed to grow, other than for personal use. So it's really confusing to me. I can't imagine somebody living next door upstairs to a retail store or a manufacturer having people coming in and out, having the smells, just having all that traffic. So that's one thing that I would ask you to consider. Also, that I just want to ask that the outdoor personal growth be not allowed. And the Board of Supervisors has not actually supported the outdoor growing. That's something that they're, I guess, considering. I think it was said that they were. But this is just a huge issue for neighbors. It's a huge nuisance issue. I've, gone to a lot of the CARP meetings. I've gone to the Goleta meetings, and this is one of the things that has really affected the quality of life for the people that are neighbors, people who are growing. So I just want to say, even though, you can grow 6 plants outdoors, I don't want you to think about little plants. Like, I've seen these plants, and they can get to be like small trees. So we're talking like big 6 small trees, like lemon trees that you've got in your backyard, that produce an incredible odor that the neighbors cannot do anything about. And a lot of people have had to go to great lengths to try to, mitigate that in their own homes and spend a lot of money to do that. And basically they're faced with selling their house to somebody who wants to live next door to 6 marijuana plants that you can't open your windows. So I just want to say the cannabis industry, even though we're looking at how to put it into our community, doesn't intrinsically enhance our community life, even though it is legalized. I just don't want to lose sight of that there's nothing really virtuous about more people being more high more often, and that the most enthusiasm is coming from the people who stand to make a lot of money from this. So I just feel that, from even people here have said in the Board of Supervisors meetings that they're doing everything they can to accommodate the cannabis industry. And I just feel like the community has really been left out. And so I just want to be a voice for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all the speaker slips I have. Does anybody else wish to come forward and speak? Not seeing anybody stand, I'll close the public input and bring it back to the commission. Do we have any comments from staff before we ask questions?
Just one comment. I noticed when I was looking something up during the testimony that you requested the square footage of each one of those zones in the slide that I showed up there. That's actually already in the EIR. If you go to starting on page 3.9-12, it sums up the amount of acreage in each one of the individual zones. And it actually even refines it more. It breaks it down to the 5 geographical areas that were analyzed. So the information is there.
Can you put it on the chart?
She's asking us to put it on the chart when we see it next time. It'd be great.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. I have one question before we, that is the issue of the Ag Preserve, the Williamson Act. I didn't get, tell me again what that was, because I think it's being misunderstood. I think you're talking about it's the value of the crop for reporting for the Williamson Act, if I remember correctly. It's not that you can't grow the marijuana in land that's under the Williamson Act. It was some other issue.
Commissioner Blau, through the chair, to clarify on alternative 2, it would extremely limit the ability to cultivate cannabis on Williamson Act lands. It would hold any given contract to an amount of only 22,000 square feet. And the valuation, you're correct, it wouldn't count in the valuation. It would actually count as developed area and would be taxed. And that is what is proposed currently as alternative 2, and that is what we talked about with the Ag Preserve Advisory Committee. But that's not necessarily their recommendation. It was really just to provide a reduced alternative for analysis and to give us some range.
Well, I guess my question is, I'm not probably as familiar with Williamson Act as the commissioner to my left, so I might ask him to weigh in. But I think I know that we don't. Are you saying that you can't grow more than 22,000 acres? Are we 22
square feet?
You just can't grow it, or you violate your...
You would be limited to one cultivation license, which currently under the state licensing program would be a maximum of 22,000 square feet. So it would be a very small amount allowed per contract holder.
And the reason for that is?
It's just, it was just a reduced alternative to consider to give us a reasonable range of alternatives, and it was something that the Agricultural Preserve Advisory Committee in their discussions, they said to consider as a very limited project proposal to consider allowing only one license per contract holder, basically as a baby step forward into allowing this industry on contract lands and to maintaining a wide supply of other types of agriculture.
Mr. Brown.
And that was their most recent recommendation?
Commissioner Brown, through the chair, it wasn't an actual recommendation, I really want to make sure that's clear. They have not yet made a recommendation, but this was discussed at their hearing, and then we agreed to include it as a reduced alternative.
Okay.
It's by no means fixed, and it's...
Okay, good. Okay, that's helpful.
Thank
you. I just have two more. The issue of EDRNs. I don't recall seeing any information in the EIR. Probably I didn't get to all the 608 pages. Is there any discussion about EDRNs?
There is a Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, there's a general discussion in the land use chapter.
Right.
It does identify the various communities out there that have EDRNs.
And what does it say, basically?
It just acknowledges that they have been given that designation, but the fact that it has that designation doesn't really change the environmental analysis. You just look at what's actually on the ground and look at environmental impacts.
But the EDRN doesn't, it's a fairly constrained map. It doesn't include a big area, or does it? I don't know. For the Tepisque area, do you know?
Typically it's only the developed existing
Areas.
communities. That's what an EDRN. It's just acknowledging in these rural areas you have these pre-existing communities where if they were coming in now proposing entirely new, you'd be treating them very differently.
Okay. And the micro business, the CUP, why would you need a CUP for that? I don't understand the reason for that.
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, because there are a mix of uses that are allowed in, in the microbusiness license. So, for example, there's a non-volatile manufacturing component to it. Given that some of the zones in which microbusiness licenses were under consideration were also considered to be zones where it may or may not be appropriate to have a use like non-volatile manufacturing, the consensus was that it'd be appropriate to have a conditional use permit because the concept behind a conditional use permit is that a use that's typically inappropriate for a given area may be allowed under very specific conditions. And the thought was for a micro business, because it has those various uses, some of which may not be appropriate for the zones in which it could be allowed, we would want to take a closer look at the micro business activity to make sure that it could be allowed once again under specific conditions with the CUP.
You know, I could see that in the commercial zone districts because it's kind of cultivating is sort of would be an anomaly there, but it's allowed in Ag 2, and so I'm not sure I get why it would, because distribution, I believe, is it not, is allowed in that area. The only piece is just retail is not. Can you just
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, I think another way of looking at it is, for example, take the C1 zone. Standalone license types that are under consideration, as you can see, is the non-volatile manufacturing, and you have retail. Micro businesses allow cultivation, which by itself is not allowed in the C1 zone. So what you'd be considering as a part of the CUP is, could it be allowed in that zone where you would have cultivation, given that cultivation typically is not allowed in that zone?
No, I got that, and I think I said that, but in an Ag 2 zone district, or even an Ag 1 zone district, where you can where some of these things are allowed, it would seem to make sense except for the retail, which I guess if you allowed it in Ag 1, you could have an Ag 1 parcel, they're all one another, then you have the concentration of the retail aspect adjacent. I don't know, maybe that's, we haven't really discussed that, I don't know.
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, because as you can see, retail by itself is not allowed in the ag zones.
I know.
But the micro business, at least for in the ag 2 zone, would have a retail component. That's just another reason why it may be appropriate to require a CUP for a micro business in that zone, because you'd want to take a look at those various activities and make sure it is appropriate given the purpose and objective of the zone. And specifically with regard to ag zones, we always got to keep in the back of our mind the fact that there's been a lot of controversy over the years about how much non-agricultural development or accessory development should be allowed on agricultural zones. So we got to be cognizant that we do not allow something with regard to cannabis that we're not allowing in a similarly situated sort of industry, like, for example, the winery industry or something like that.
And to pick up Mrs. Close's comment concerning the MU zone district, where retail is proposed. And I see in the EIR, just for discussion purposes, that pot lounges were discussed. They weren't analyzed, but I don't understand why you would allow a bar, a residential property next to a pot lounge. That just doesn't, it seems to me that there's really hugely incompatible uses with that, and there's been no discussion about any sort of separation or buffer or anything in the EIR that would allow for these things to be located together. I don't get it. Help me get it. Maybe I'll never get it.
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, I mean, there are differences of opinion about what's appropriate in the mixed use zone, but I think what has been emphasized very clearly is the residential component to mixed use. But let's not forget that's only half the equation. There's also a commercial component to a mixed use zone. And I think one thing we also got to keep in mind when considering cannabis is that look at similarly situated non-cannabis uses that we're already allowing in mixed use zones. So for example, if you were to allow some sort of retail store that sold alcohol, or if you have a restaurant with a bar or something like that, there are certain people who take the opinion that that is equivalent to allowing the sale or use of cannabis products. Some people look at it as being equivalent. So we're not making a recommendation at this point in time. We don't have an opinion on the matter. We're just throwing it out there for consideration. If you find it to be inappropriate after hearing all the testimony, you're more than welcome to make a recommendation to ban it or control it in a different fashion in those zones.
I get that, and what I get also is that there are, from what I read in this document, it's the crime and security issues, it's the cash business issue. Well, normally, most businesses in our now mixed-use zone districts don't have those issues. It's the conjunctive parking use issue, which we put into the community plan where the mixed use, well, you know, the business was there to the day and they weren't there at night. Well, I think the cannabis retail is 24/7 or whatever the hours are. So there's other issues that weren't even really picked up in the document, and that's kind of my issue, my not understanding fully why you'd recommend it. But the other issue coming from that also is many jurisdictions have, we're speaking of residences, have a buffer, 100 feet, 150 feet, on parcels that are adjacent to commercial property, residential adjacent to commercial properties. They have a buffer of 100 feet or 150 feet just to separate these uses. I've read that, Washington State, Oregon, I'm not sure where else. But I see there's nothing considering the nature of the way it's described in here about the importance of residential uses, community character and quality of life. There's no consideration about any of those sort of very limited buffers. Was that ever considered? I see nothing in the document here. What about from staff?
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, there was a lot in that comment, but first off, quality of life issues were evaluated in the EIR to the extent that they would result in physical impacts to the environment and are within the realm of analysis under CEQA. That would be further considered when you're considering the actual ordinance amendments. That would come into consideration, for example, when you're considering whether or not you can make the findings that your action is furthering the public health, safety, and welfare, that'd be another opportunity to do so. But just when it comes to the buffer issue specifically, once again, the minimum buffer is going to be 600 feet from use serving facilities from the state. And the board has the discretion to increase those based upon considerations that come up in the deliberative process. And if you come to the conclusion that these uses, you just can't make them fit in the mixed use zone, you can make a recommendation to the board to ban them or come up with some sort of regulations that would make them fit, if you see that.
I get that, but the impact statement only really deals with the 600-foot buffer by the state. It doesn't really speak to any of these other issues, and it's a little...
Excuse me, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, specifically what other issues? Because I want to make sure we adequately address whatever you believe is lacking in the EIR.
It's the buffer, the separation from the residential piece. I'm just thinking an example. In Goleta, where I live, there's the Calle Real Shopping Center, and then right adjacent to that shopping center, 50 feet is a residential complex. It seems to me that if you had something like that in the county, you would want to have some separation such that you wouldn't have a retail outlet there or some other...
One manner in which you could address that came up, for example, during the September 19th hearing with the Board of Supervisors, where some of the board members were saying, in addition to the buffers that are already required under state law, they also want to see setback requirements. For example,
so
if you're going to have cultivation, like on an ag property, have it separated if there's an existing residence on an adjacent property. So you could approach it that way.
That's helpful. Thank you. All right.
Mr. Freeney.
Just going back to the Williamson Act discussion. So I heard it said that CDFA has determined that cannabis is an ag product. So is that, I guess, one, we need to, is that true? Right, so that is agriculture. I mean, they're going to the Ag Commissioner's office.
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Freeney, I hate to sound like a litigious attorney, but it depends on the actual regulation that you are looking at. Some of the regulations treat it as, for example, an agricultural commodity. Other sections of the law seem to treat it more as agriculture itself. And this gets back to the discussion we had during the last hearing where, this gets to a much more fundamental question as to how people define agriculture. And what it really boils down to in the regulatory context is which law you're looking at. So I think it's safe to say that the state generally thinks it's an agricultural commodity, and they're deferring to local jurisdictions with regard to how they would like to regulate this agricultural commodity when it comes to their own uniform rules with the Land Conservation Act or other general plan or other land use and planning laws. So it depends on the law you're looking at.
Okay, so then I get that. Okay, so now if we add on to that Williamson Act and trying to restrict their use on Williamson Act land, I just don't see how that's going to hold up, and you're going to say, no, you can't do this particular type of agriculture. So to me, I just don't, we're probably in the wrong way we're not in deliberations or anything, but I just don't think, that's a valid alternative to knock the Williamson Act land out. I think there's so many problems we would have with that.
I think we are in deliberations because we're not going to vote or do anything today. We're simply giving staff direction on our thoughts and our comments and what we might want brought back at the next hearing for further review. I mean, Commissioner Brown has given you a number of ones to bring back, and I'm not done it yet either, so I think we are. So Commissioner St. John, are you finished, or do you want to continue?
No.
Go, continue on.
No, but I'll share. If you want to tag on that one. No, okay. Okay. So with that, I just don't see how we can say we're going to do that differently. And I guess, is that covered in the EIR on where we're saying you would take out, that is alternative 2 in the EIR is no, yes. and they think that would have no significant impact?
Oh, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Farina, it's not that it would have no significant impact. It would reduce some of the impacts that would result with the project that's evaluated in the EIR. So.
Okay, all right, and then the other one was buffers. we have the letter from Carpinteria Unified School District, and they're discussing the odors that are migrating onto their property. Do you know, is that from open cultivation, or is that from greenhouse cultivation, or is that mixed in that area?
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Farini, it's unclear the exact source, because depending on the wind patterns, that affects what you're smelling and from where you're getting the odors. So it's difficult to pinpoint one source, but we do know that they're both open field cultivation operations in the Carpinteria Valley, plus greenhouses are located within proximity to high school. I want to venture a guess, but I want to avoid that because it's too controversial of an issue to conjecture.
So to date, we don't have a sniffer that can smell that compound, and we can go like we do a DBA meter to a property boundary and pick that chemical up.
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Farini, the challenge is getting access to all of the possible properties who could possibly be generating the odors. So you could go to a known site and take measurements, and there are ways to measure odor, which I've learned in my other job. But the problem, though, is concluding that the odor that you're experiencing is definitively coming from that location when you have so many possible sources within proximity to one another. So it's really an access, time, and measurement sort of question. So.
Yeah, the unfortunate outcome of that is what we're saying is no matter what regulations we put in, we're not going to be able to enforce the smell factor, and that seems to be one of the big things. I mean, here I'm very concerned about this. I know there's, in our type of agriculture, we have certain limitations on what we can do within a quarter mile of a school. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so, and that's a new regulation that came out about, time flies, so maybe it's been 2 or 3 years, right? And so that has limited that activity, and of course we have different mitigation measures and how we control that. But I just think we're going to have to be very careful and sensitive to this type of issue. I think buffering, I kind of like the quarter mile rule, but that may not work. The other thing is buffering within, I'd like to see some information on buffering within a parcel. A minimum of 100 feet, preferably 300 feet from the property line inward would be where open cultivation would occur, but then this filtering thing, you touched on filtering of the greenhouses, and the technology has evolved. Hopefully we can get a flavor for that so that I could make an informed decision as to whether I could support something like that. And I think you're dead on. I think there's been great progress in that, and I think it can be done. Then whether we would put higher constraints closer to EDRNs, or however you want to define that. Specifically, though, going back, we have a school district that's put us on notice here. So I think the schools are one level. The CDFA treats schools on a different level than urban communities. So I'd like to look at both of those.
What is it? Can you speak to that?
So we cannot do certain activities within 1,320 square feet of a school without mitigation measures, what time you do it, how big of your project is.
You can't fertilize the kids.
Oh, interesting.
Okay.
Oh, interesting.
So, but you can do it within 300 feet of a neighborhood. Okay, so there are different levels that exist in ag. Okay. And that is really for the outdoor cultivation, because I think we're going to have a lot of issues on that in urban interface. Okay, the greenhouses, I think they have a different set. It looks like they can control it better.
Commissioner St. John, did you wish to say anything?
Yes, I have a few questions. One is related to the hoop ordinance, because hoops are an integral part of this. And given your workload, how do you see that coming to us? Are we going to know what the hoop ordinance looks like before we act on this, or is it coming after?
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John. Yeah, the timing, when the cannabis project took off, we realized that the hoop structure ordinance amendment is kind of elevated in priority. So, but unfortunately, we are not going to get that to your commission before you're making a decision on the cannabis ordinance. Right now, they're in the initial stages of that project. Notice of preparation for the EIR is out for public comment. So I'd have to go back and double check the schedule for that project. But in February, we definitely will not have those ordinances before you. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. If we could probably provide you with an update if you find that would be helpful, or to give you an idea about what's going on with that project. But I don't know how much it will inform the cannabis project. But if you have a specific question with regard to hoop structures and cannabis, we'll do our best to answer that or resolve it. So.
Okay, but our overall watchword would be, if we determined in the cannabis ordinance to allow cannabis in hoop structures, then whenever that ordinance comes around, those would be the land use rules about the hoops for cannabis, unless we made some other caveats.
Correct, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John. And I'm sorry to obfuscate, but yeah, and we are looking at most likely about mid to late spring is when you would be seeing the hoop structures ordinance amendment. So it's not too far beyond the time you'd be considering cannabis. But yeah, that's exactly the time where you would want to take a look at that and see if anything needs to be tweaked in that ordinance due to something specific to cannabis. We could do so as a part of that.
Okay, I understand. Another question, I am concerned, and you touched on it in some of your comments to Commissioner Brown. I am concerned because in the 3rd District, the protection of Ag 1, particularly that has residential, has been a big issue. And like you said, we have to sometimes think of cannabis in terms of what if it was liquor, what if it was wine. And we've been through those issues with the wineries. So I'm getting inquiries. One of them is, and I realize this is the dilemma of the programmatic EIR. One of them is, how are special events, or how would cannabis special events be handled? Is that something that would be in the permit conditions of a specific use, or is there any review of that in this document?
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John. Yeah, there's no consideration right now of, for example, changing our existing regulations that apply to events. So what is currently in effect would still apply, and it would apply to the cannabis industry as well. What I will say, though, is I'd have to go back and take a look at the regulations to see if there's anything in there that would conflict with the cannabis regulations or anything. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but long story short is those same regulations that are currently in effect for events would continue to apply. There's no changes with regard to what would be allowed, just given the fact that you would have this cannabis use on the property.
Okay, sort of related question. I'm also getting a lot of questions about, I know you're working on the farm stay rules, and the questions I'm getting are you taking into account potential cannabis with regard to the farm stays on cannabis farms?
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John, wow, that's one I haven't thought of yet, but hasn't been considered yet. But if there's a specific concern that somebody has that they would like us to take a look at, we could do so. But once again, these are disparate uses, and the allowance of one does not necessarily mean that you're going to see more of the others. So I don't see this having any effect on our evaluation of the farm stay regulations, but
happens in Washington State.
I'm getting a lot of questions, so I wanted to ask. I think the concern is bringing tourism to again, you'd have to look at the definition of agriculture, but if it's to a working agricultural property to participate in cannabis productions and then, have cannabis parties. I think that's the concern. Okay. I think I had one more question. Oh, again, semi-related to the wineries. I'm getting both kinds of concerns, so I want to just let you know that one concern, and I will let the vintners speak for themselves, and they'll probably weigh in on the EIR, but I've had 2 inquiries about, with just the concern about the outdoor growing and the odors interfering with visitation at wineries with a neighboring use, and so I think it's spoken to very briefly in the EIR that there's not much mitigation that can be done on an outdoor growing situation, but I'm passing along that concern, which is therefore a concern for me in my area. And then the opposite concern is, what would be the process if a winery wanted to convert all or part of its growing and its tasting facilities and public visitation facilities to cannabis? Would it need to go through, start over a permit process and go through as a cannabis applicant, or can it just convert? Which I wouldn't think would be possible.
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John, yes, they would still have to apply for whatever entitlement is required for the cannabis activity. So they would be back in the permit process with us.
So they would basically be reopening their permit or starting a whole new permit on their parcel. Would be like a second permit they would get?
Yeah, Commissioner Chair, Commissioner St. John, the devil's in the details as to what they want to do. So let's assume that they wanted to completely discontinue the winery operation and they want to just now do all cannabis. They would apply. All they'd have to do at that point is apply for the entitlements for the cannabis activities. However, let's say they wanted to continue doing a winery process or operation on their property, and let's say they already have an entitlement for that, for let's say it's a development plan, and then they now want to come in and apply for entitlements for cannabis activities. What you would have to look at is what modification, if any, is required to the existing development plan to account for the change in the winery operation. And depending on the level of change, that would dictate what sort of entitlement is, either a substantial conformity determination or maybe some sort of amendment to the development plan. Or it may be the case that you don't have to change it all. It all depends on how they propose to change the operation. And in addition to that, you'd also have to get your new entitlements for the cannabis operation as well.
Okay, thank you.
So just in the in both issues, the farm stay and the conversion of a vineyard and winery to cannabis, can someone staying on someone's farm that's growing cannabis, can they give the cannabis away to let people use it, test it, try it? Is that permissible?
Commissioner Chair, Commissioner Brown, there are specific regulations in state law with regard to how you can distribute. So first off, for personal use, it's supposed to be just that, personal use. You're not supposed to be giving it away for commercial purposes.
But this is not personal use. This is...
Right, so I'm getting in there, just one sec. So alternatively, if you are selling it to somebody, you are now conducting a commercial activity, or if you're getting payment for the opportunity to stay here and then you're also going to get cannabis for that, that could be another situation. It depends on the actual relationship between whoever is distributing the cannabis and who's receiving it.
Maybe Ms. Hartley needs to weigh in on that question. So then just to follow on from that, if you had a winery tasting room, which was now, could you do a cannabis tasting room for edibles, or where you're just giving this stuff away? I don't know. We're kind of into new territory here.
So, Chair and Commissioners, there are some specific requirements in the state law regarding both gifts of cannabis as well as consumption in terms of both how much you're allowed to have in terms of quantities as well as grow. And I believe there are some separate sections regarding the last item that you referenced, giving away or tasting rooms, correct? So I can go through and try to pull those up quickly. I don't have them right in front of me, but there are specific requirements on those.
Yeah, come back next meeting and would be a good one. More questions. I have a couple of comments. It seems to me that if we were to only allow the cannabis to be grown in greenhouses, we solve lots and lots of problems. I see perhaps a bit of a problem with eighth aesthetics because greenhouses are not generally attractive buildings, although the new one at Winsett Farms, pretty attractive buildings and pretty attractive complex. I think if you had a cannabis operation and it was within that kind of a facility, there wouldn't be much complaint. So I'm curious to know if that's something we should consider in our recommendations. I would, having said that, it'd be interesting to know a little bit more about the odor sequestration technology, how good it really is. I mean, if this is your typical greenhouse, can we get rid of 99% of the odors that are generated by the cannabis growth? I'm curious to know that. Couple other things that I think we should consider. We talk about the process for getting approvals going forward. It seems to me, at least in the beginning, it needs to come to the Planning Commission and not at some lower level. Because I just don't envision the staff to be consistently applying conditions like we would typically do. There's just 5 of us. There's a whole lot more staff that would be perhaps involved in the in the approval process. And then it wouldn't surprise me that in a year or so, as part of our streamline process, we quantify certain kinds of operations that the director could handle. But until that happens, I think we need to look at every one of them. I also would have some concern about our current noticing provisions. I don't think even 1,000 feet is an adequate notice for these kind of operations. Unlike, typical plan development permits where, we're approving apartment projects or we're approving something else, this could have more far-reaching effects and could adversely affect people at greater distances. I'm thinking it needs to be several thousand feet and maybe as much as a mile in diameter for these kind of operations, especially places like Tepesquei Canyon. You're talking about maybe only noticing 1 or 2 people. And that's not much of a notice since it can adversely affect them. I also need you to come back and talk to me more about Tepesquei Canyon. I don't consider as a real agricultural area for the county. I mean, I know we zone it ag because we don't have what I would call large parcel residential, but that's really what Tepesquei Canyon is large parcels and it's residential. In fact, I'm trying to remember if I saw any farms there at all. You probably could tell me. Anybody farming that, other than maybe a winery or two? I don't even think there's any wineries. I mean, maybe some wine grapes up there. But Tepesquei Canyon it's not Ag 1 and it's not Ag 2. It's a bunch of ranchettes or, sort of mountainous kind of parcels that people build their houses on. I get that. I also get the idea that the road is not even a good farm road, to be the truth. I mean, I won't have anything to drink and drive Tepesquei Canyon Road. Nothing. I mean, it's not even a beer. So I'd like you to come back and talk to me about opportunities to where we could overlay those kinds of areas with some kind of a residential flavor or justification so that we could not end up with 100 farms in that area. Of course, if we do the greenhouses, it may prevent that anyway. I'm not sure you would get approval for the aesthetics in a greenhouse in Tepesquei Canyon. That's another whole issue. Those are my thoughts. Commissioner Brown, you have your light on again.
Okay, great. Well, those were some good comments, and I think this was a helpful meeting to sort of get down into the weeds, if you will. I know everybody uses that. Sorry. Bad. Just in looking at the zoning tables, I'm just trying to reconcile the information I learned at the City of Goleta meeting where I live in the city. They had their first cannabis meeting, and we heard from quite a few operators about the importance of the testing function and about the lack of spaces to do this. And I'm just thinking that as I consider, and I've had this conversation with Dan before, about the PI zone district, which is on the south coast, the cemetery, the juvenile hall, the morgue, you're not going to be locating and testing activity there. Why? Because it's a fairly benign type of activity. It's a 8 to 5, I'm guessing. It's a machinery. It's a small space. Why those couldn't go into any of the commercial zone districts or even to the MU zone districts, because you don't have the sort of the incompatibility uses that you would have with the retail piece, and it would expand places where this could occur, because I understand it's a very important piece of sort of the entire process. So I'd like to staff to kind of think about that and maybe come back with that. And maybe there's some other sort of anomalies we really haven't heard from the industry. I think there is one letter in there about the industrial zones where there really aren't. I'm not even sure what's on industrial zones. There's so few of them in the county. How much land is even available for that? I'll have to go look at those tables that Dan pointed out to see. But maybe that's another one there's some anomaly there, that there's some, maybe the Cellite manufacturing plant is on an industrial zone. I have no idea what's on those things. So maybe if staff knows, you could come back and just tell us, because if we're trying to facilitate places for the operators to do their business, then we want to make sure that's in the right zone district.
Well, I would follow up and ask the staff. I mean, we have appropriate zoning codes for testing facilities, testing laboratories. I don't care whether it's blood or food or what. And so why would we need to have a different set of regulations for testing chemicals in marijuana? I don't get that.
Yeah, Commissioner Chair. Actually, it's interesting because the way our code is set up, it doesn't list each and every type of possible use or business that exists out there. So what you got to do is, when you're going through an activity like this, you go and you try to find a use that is as closely related to what is being proposed as possible, and you just don't have a really good, precise fit for something that's totally equivalent to the testing labs that are envisioned here. They'd be most similar to like the testing labs for agricultural products. But so once again, there's no, for example, line item for just testing laboratories in our ordinance. So we got to kind of look at what's already allowed, see what it's mostly equivalent to, and see, okay, is it within the realm of reason to say that because you're allowing that other use, you're going to allow this type of use here too. So when you look at the code, the types of uses that are probably most closely similar to testing labs are things like medical offices and facilities, research labs, and I know that there's been questions about why did we allow it in the professional institutional zone. That's because you can see research labs in those sorts of zones. And so the logic is that you would find if you're going to allow that sort of use in the zone, you should also consider allowing the testing lab. And the types of uses that are set forth for the commercial zones, they are fairly different from testing labs. They're more, as you would anticipate, retail sales sorts of uses that are listed there. And then for the uses that are not typically found in the commercial zones, then they jump up to requiring like a conditional use permit or something of that nature. So,
Commissioner Freedy.
Alternative 3 says reduce registrants, and I think we talked about Al Capone a little bit, and maybe that might be an unintended consequence of promoting illegal activity. So I was wondering if you had looked at any type of density control. And I thought we did something on at-home businesses at one time. If you were making cookies, you could only have so many per block. And so if we did the same thing and said, okay, you have 100 acres, and personally, I want to see that buffered, and I'm talking about outdoor, okay, not indoor. And I think what'll happen, it'll evolve. But if you say you're going to have to buffer 300 feet from your property line where your production is, and only a certain percentage of your property can be under production, and only so much production in a certain area, in a square mile, however we define that, that would help us, I think, down the road with with enforcement and knowing where the smells are and if they are becoming a nuisance. I don't know if there's support for that or if that's too far out.
I'll make comment on it.
Okay.
To start,
That's the thought.
You see that with liquor license for on-sale liquor. You know, you're only allowed to have so many in a county, and they can,
So many
and it's based on population, by the way. For dispensing, I could see that because the analysis, I mean, it's analysis to selling liquor. For the production, the growth, I'm not sure how you do that, and it always bothers me when we try and come up with a regulation, a rule, or a scheme to try and control an unpopular output when that's just not the way you should do it. I mean, there's going to be ways to get around that. If the odor is the problem, let's address the odor. And if you can't, if you're in a situation where you're growing outdoors or growing open fields, and that odor is going to adversely impact somebody downwind, you can't do it there. You either go find some place to do it where that's not a problem, do it indoors, sequester the odors, and so forth. To sit there and say, no, you only have so much production because we think that'll control the odor. No, it doesn't. Let's go control the odor, is my concern. The dispensing part, I would agree with you. I mean, I could be just like the ABC and say, no, we can't have a liquor store on every other block. It's not, so they limit the number of licenses so that it makes sense. I mean, adequate number so we don't have monopoly problems, that sort of thing. But so I understand the idea, but I think we just need to let's attack the problem. In Tippescay, for example, you may not be able to have a location to grow it that doesn't adversely affect your neighbor. So there you go. Can't do it. I mean, it's kind of like you could no longer crush chili peppers in that building next to the golf course, because for 2 months when they're crushing chili peppers, you couldn't play golf. Your eyes would burn. So they stopped them from doing it. So that'd be my thought. Mr. Brown, you had a thought?
I guess it's what looms in the back of my mind are all the ag properties in Carp, where if you start, and I appreciate if you were starting with a clean slate, that might be a way to do it, but whatever, Carp is all Ag 1, and I don't know how you get over that hurdle. If you limit who can do what where, it's all going to be legal non-conforming, and you get back to you got to control the odor issue. If you control the odor issue, I think the Ag 1 issue goes away there. I don't think but I think it's the odor. That's all we've ever heard in any of the meetings I've been to. And
well, my point is they control it or they can't do it. It's really pretty simple. And I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking that's a Class 1 impact, we don't allow projects if you can't mitigate the Class 1 impact. Now, I could easily disagree with you on the other issues that were on your chart as to whether they're Class 1 or Class 2, but the odor, I can't argue with. I mean, it makes some people sick to their stomach. I mean, you can't have your children trying to go to school and being put up with that kind of a problem. I get it. So I think you're going to have to come back to us and say, you control the odor, or the odor is not affecting anybody if you're growing outdoors, or we're not going to give you the approval the land use approval. And I'd be curious to know if the rest of you agree or disagree.
I support that, and I guess my question to Ms. Hartley is, if you had an odor abatement plan and you had a condition in there or a development standard that said if you can't control the odor, and I'm not sure how you would do that, what measurement you would do, can you shut them down or give them a legal an amortization period where that's it, you haven't shown that you can control odors and therefore you're out of business? How does that work? Let's see.
So, Chair and Commissioners, typically in any permit that you issue, there are conditions, and those conditions are subject to enforcement by planning and development. And the path for enforcement is typically outlined currently in the zoning in the county's various zoning ordinances that allow for an administrative process. But that's something that has been of discussion today, and that will be before probably your commission and the board as to what sort of enforcement tools you want to have set forth. But typically, if there is a condition in a permit and that condition is not followed, then it is subject to enforcement.
Commissioner St. John.
To follow on to that, I work in the solid waste and recycling industry, and the issue of odors from landfills and from compost facilities is one that I have a lot of experience with. And odor is an issue to be respected. So I want to bolster Dan's, Commissioner Blau's concern, because it's a very subjective test. You can get out there with a sniffer, but one person will be nauseous and the other person next door won't even have noticed. And the air pollution control districts have really grappled with this because there is no objective standard like a decibel standard for noise. And they have taken some pretty draconian measures when they cannot, and in these cases, the source was clear. It was the landfill, it was the compost facility. But they've taken some pretty draconian measures to shut things down until there is no odor, and it's a morass and a rabbit hole if you start down those. So I would tell us to go cautiously and really look at what we can do about enforcement, because you do have to be prepared to shut it down if you can't fix it. And the winds, just like with compost and with landfills, the winds and the climate conditions, like it explains in the EIR, really govern when it's bad, and when there's an inversion layer, or when it's cool, or when it's hot, or when the wind is blowing right at you. It can be fine one day and horrible the next. So.
Well, I get that, but what I'm hearing so far, and I'm real curious to have you bring back more information, but if you come back and tell me there's a technology there that if they grow this within the greenhouse and we can sequester 98% of the odor, or somehow scrub it, clean it. I mean, I know there's all kinds of things you can do for all kinds of other odors that are generated by different factories. That may lead me to make the recommendation as greenhouse only, that no open cultivation. I mean,
So, I like that idea. It simplifies things, and I think it works in most cases. There again, you go out into the open farmland countries where there's not people living, and that's real commercial ag, and you've got big parcels and big land, and a guy wants to go open cultivate out there. I'd like to see us try to accommodate that in some fashion, but if we're talking about, we're in the middle of Carpinteria and we've got schools and people, that's a different issue. And I think you've come up with a real good plan there. We make it real simple.
Right. Either sequester the odor, you can't do it. It's kind of like it. I agree. We were talking about the special events ordinance, and we were going to limit a farmer to 12, special events a year. Well, there's this our farm in Lompoc. It's 6,000 acres. It's 2.5 miles to his nearest neighbor. Nobody cares if he has a wedding every damn weekend, because no one's going to know it. So I agree with you. You got 6,000 acres, and you got no neighbors within 2 or 3 miles. There's no odor concerns. Plant all the cannabis you want.
So maybe that's Ag 2-100 or something, and
something,
some type of density that.
And it may be you talk about 300-foot bumpers. Maybe it's way more than that. Maybe it's 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet or a mile buffer. I don't know.
I did a little math. So, if you did a 300-foot buffer on a 40-foot piece or 40-acre piece, it'd take 20 acres of it. Yeah. Okay. So, if you up the game to a 100-acre parcel, and he had to buffer 50 acres, you'd still have 50 in the middle. So it would still be feasible, I think. It'd be economically viable and all that. So probably 100 acres.
So, more questions, more comments, thoughts, ideas.
I think there's a lot of balls in the air that you get that are still up there that you probably won't know until you get the final thing from the state. But I would like to see kind of just some thinking about some of the zoning issues on all these kind of call these zone districts, because I don't think that that's what you've got is a good first start, but I think there's some other things, thinking that needs to go into the chart too.
I'll just say for me, except for the growing, the chart's probably okay. I mean, it's like, the baking, the manufacturing, it doesn't seem to have the same problems. Is this going to go back to the board before it comes to us again or not? Are they going to comment? Oh, why don't you go back on the 17th or something?
Yeah, so once again, it's going to go to the board on November 14th, so it'll definitely go back to them before we get back to you. Actually, let me go pull up the slide.
I'd be curious to know what their comments might be when you come back to us again on the comments that we made to you today about the greenhouse only, the sequestration of the odors, or the huge buffers that we're talking about. Also, the idea that it would go before the Planning Commission for any approvals until such time as we recommend that they have some other path. Just, it'd be fun to know that before when you come back.
Chair, I think you'll be pleased to know that the board did ask for the conceptual conversation that was held in September to bring back a summary of that to this November 14th meeting. And I would just characterize, what happened in open session there were a series of similar concerns and suggestions to what your commission has been discussing here this morning. So we will bring that back and actually try to firm up and kind of check for that consensus that we were seeking in September.
Okay. Great. Anything else from the staff? Anything else from the commission? I think we're adjourned.